All right. Shall we start?
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all so very much for being here today. Many, many thanks to our speakers. Many thanks to the Dean of School of Social and Educational Sciences at the University of Cyprus. And of course, many, many thanks to all the participants in the audience. Without further ado, please allow me to give the floor to Professor Eleni Ftiaka, the Dean of School of Social and Educational Sciences at the University of Cyprus. Professor.
Thank you. So good evening, everybody, or good morning, or whatever it is in your country. I'm very happy to be here with you. It looks like a wonderful company, actually. You should have warned me, Nadia. I would have participated from the very beginning. So I have a few words here. I'll just say them as an introduction to the symposium tonight, and I'm sure you're going to expand on what I'm going to say in these first lines. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this online symposium on intersectionality and activism in difficult times. It's a shame you cannot be here at the University of Cyprus. We have a wonderful time. It's still summer. You would have enjoyed it very much, I think. Now, intersectionality is a framework developed to understand how different markers of identity, for example, race, class, ethnicity, disability, which is my area, status, gender, and sexuality intersect to produce different forms of exclusion and inequality, as well as disparate experiences, prospects, and outcomes. Having its roots in social justice activism and the experiences of Black women, intersectionality is not an abstract notion, but a description of the way multiple oppressions are experienced. It is also concrete action that aims to challenge power structures, privilege, and exclusion. Therefore, intersectionality is often invoked as a guiding principle in national and transnational activism to identify goals, strategies, and desired outcomes. In difficult times, times of COVID-19, of curtailing of women's, LGBT, and disability rights, of environmental crisis, of polarization, of troubled democracy, and of social, political, and economic phenomena that transcend national borders and challenge hard-won feminist and intersectional social justice principle achievements, this online symposium is very timely. The speakers in the program, whom I have just met, I was delighted to meet, Jean, University of California, Santa Barbara, Phillip Ayoub from Occidental College, Elizabeth Evans from Goldsmiths, University of London, Lydia Hiraide from Goldsmiths, University of London as well, and Eleanor Lepidar, yes, University of Lausanne, are renowned scholars who have produced important and cutting-edge international research on the topic of the online symposium. Therefore, they are uniquely placed to debate this and highlight the key themes, trends, and current practices for the audience. I would like to thank you all for accepting the invitation to present your work at this online symposium organized by Nadia Kamen, who is a new colleague and a very enthusiastic and hardworking scholar in our university. As part of the public academic events of the Department of Social Sciences in my school, the School of Social and Educational Sciences at the University of Cyprus. Both the department and the school are devoted to research and activities that promote exchange and develop links between academia and society. So I would also like to thank members of the public for their participation. I sincerely hope that you will enjoy the online symposium and the discussions it will instigate. And I wish that next time we do this by physical presence and we have you here with us, okay? You will allow me to step down now and let Naya continue. Thank you very much for participating, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the symposium. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so the first presentation is going to be delivered by Jean Beaman, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, with affiliations in Black Studies, Political Science, Feminist Studies, Global Studies, and the Center for Black Studies Research. Her research is ethnographic in nature and focuses on race, ethnicity, racism, international migration, and state-sponsored violence in both France and the United States. She's author of Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France, published by University of California Press in 2017. The title of Jean's presentation is Fighting Marginalization from the Margins Before and During COVID-19. Jean, welcome.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone from California. I'm really excited to be here. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Okay, so yes, thank you so much, Naya, for including me and for organizing this symposium. I'm really excited to be here with these esteemed guests and be part of this conversation. So I have a lot that I want to cover in my short presentation, so I'm just going to kind of dive in, and hopefully the slides are working okay. So what I'm going to do is talk about my ongoing ethnographic research on marginalization, race and racism, and citizenship in France, and then I think connect it to issues present in the sort of COVID-19 pandemic. And as I'll talk about, I'm going to think about marginalization, or try to think about marginalization across different axes, such as race and gender primarily, but not exclusively. So the general sort of question of my research agenda is thinking through how citizens remain on the margins of mainstream society and what this reveals for how race and ethnicity operate in practice. And so this is a question that I've been thinking about for years, but I think also is revelatory in thinking about the present moment of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'll get to shortly. So my first book, pictured here, was an ethnography in the Paris metropolitan area, including semi-structured interviews with 45 children of Maghrebian immigrants, and documenting the multiple ways in which this population and racial and ethnic minorities in France more generally are excluded. Specifically, I talk about how individuals can be assimilated across socioeconomic lines, such as having a sort of professional or middle-class status, yet still be marginalized based on their race and ethnicity, and kind of what that theoretically reveals. Ultimately, I framed this population as citizen outsiders, hence the title of the book, as a way of getting at, or it was the term that I borrow, from political scientist Kathy Cohen, that she uses to characterize the precarious social locations of Black American youth. And this is a framework that's very much rooted in Black feminist thought, and even thinking about thinkers as varied as Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, and Patricia Hill Collins, who have all simultaneously theorized how individuals can be, formal members of a society, yet still excluded from sort of being part of that society, and sort of what it means to kind of live in that tension. Okay, just making sure the chat comment wasn't for me. Okay. Okay. So ultimately what I do is demonstrate the sort of challenge the French exceptionalism, or due to its Republican ideology, which I don't have much time to go into today, but regarding notions of race, ethnicity, and difference, and I'll come back to that as well. I ultimately argue that the middle class North African second generation is denied cultural citizenship to be fully accepted as French by others. So even though they are a population that understands themselves as French, they are not treated that way by the compatriots. And so that's the sort of axes that I focus on, or one of the axes I focus on in my research. So, what was one of the dominant sort of paradigms that arose when COVID-19 first became, recognized as a global pandemic is being this sort of great equalizer. And, speaking from the vantage point of the United States, that was one of the narratives we encountered often. But this is yet another example, well, one, besides not being true, it's another way to see, or the COVID-19 pandemic is another way of seeing how racial and ethnic disparities persist despite, in the case of France, the lack of state recognition or official categories. So I use the framework, as I mentioned in my book, of cultural citizenship as a way of thinking through how individuals are actually received or included or fully included or traversing or able to traverse the cultural symbolic boundaries around national identity, and thinking about who actually is able to belong. And I think thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic reveals this as well, for thinking about not only who is more likely to be infected or contract COVID-19, but also thinking about the different ways that COVID-19 or the pandemic or the sort of measures to prevent the spread of the pandemic disproportionately affect different communities. So just to give one very quick example, this is from, there is many sort of uprisings or riots in different communities. This is from Saint-Denis last year. And I think, one of the things that, again, COVID-19 reveals is, the sort of existing or persisting inequalities and inequities that already were occurring that I think the pandemic brought to light. And so this question of sort of heavy-handed policing, which I'll talk about shortly, in these predominantly non-white or communities read as non-white, has only exacerbated during COVID-19 as a way, under the sort of umbrella of preventing the spread of the pandemic, right? And so thinking about, for example, restrictions on movement, there was a sort of heavier, well, speaking from the United States, I feel like every place had a heavier quarantine than we did. But anyway, thinking about the sort of quarantine measures in place in France, and thinking about how certain populations or certain communities were more heavily surveilled by the police to sort of track their movement in ways that other parts of Paris or other parts of France were not, right? And so thinking about, again, like even in the global pandemic, we get these very obvious examples of how different populations are treated differently and who is really seen as belonging or having the ability to belong to mainstream society. Okay. So I've been doing ongoing ethnographic research for what will be my second book since June 2017. And that research has involved interviews with activists, journalists, family members of victims, and participant observation at demonstrations and other events related to anti-racism and police violence. And so thinking through that, and that's what I want to talk about for the remainder of my time. So by state violence, by police violence, I'm not just thinking specifically of killings by the police, but also, broader police brutality, broader harassment, broader surveillance of populations that are racialized or have been racialized as non-white in France. And again, thinking about how this racialization occurs in the absence of state level or government level categories. So one example I usually introduce when I'm talking about these topics is the 2005 Banlieue uprisings, which I think received much media attention, both nationally, internationally, here in the United States, around thinking about this is a population or that is failed to integrate into mainstream French society. However, what was often missed in the coverage of these uprisings was how it started with an incident of police violence here. Zaid and Bana, two ethnic minority teenagers who died fleeing the police and were electrocuted at a substation just outside of Paris, right? And so we miss, I think oftentimes the discourse around these uprisings misses the role of state violence and relatedly misses the role of hyper surveillance by the police of particular populations, because then I think we can, as scholars, ask, why were they fleeing the police, and what does that mean to live in communities where that's a constant occurrence, right, or that's understood to be a constant occurrence. So here I'm really building off the work of scholars such as anthropologist Paul Silverstein, who thinks about how these identity checks or these sort of, checks by the police function as creating and maintaining a second order citizenship or sort of citizenship surveillance, right? And there's been some research also by French political scientists and other social scientists on the sort of hyper surveillance of ethnic minorities, and also thinking about how these sort of interactions between the police and individuals disproportionately target, France's visible minorities, right? And so, even though the sort of phenomenon of actual police killings is perhaps, or is less than it is, here in the United States or other societies such as Brazil, there nonetheless is this growing recognition of a social problem of police violence, and a sort of recognition that of the sort of problematic relationships between ethnic minorities and the police, however that's constituted. So I've been thinking through, how the sort of specter of this police violence or state violence functions to create what I'm terming a suspect citizenship or belonging that is continually constructed in contemporary French society. And this is a way to think about how the state is creating, categories of who can belong and who's gonna always be under suspicion, or always their sort of relationship to society is always going to be tenuous. So I'm using this anti-racist mobilization and activism as a way to understand how state violence, or the sort of specter of state violence, is reinforcing this kind of second order citizenship or second class citizenship. And as I'll talk about shortly, these minority populations, therefore, in their activism, are very purposely responding to a violence that is not new, but rather an extension of the violence under French colonialism, right? So thinking about the neo-colonial aspect of the state violence. Okay, so in thinking about this, this work is in conversation with Akeem Mbe's notion of necropolitics, considering the ways that the state has the capacity to determine who is and who is not disposable, and moreover, who can and who cannot belong, as well as works by Corveg and Hiraide on the quote unquote production of non-belonging, Ural Davis's work on the quote unquote politics of belonging, Silverstein's work on a second-class citizenship, which I just discussed, and anthropologist Damani Patrige's work on the sort of construction of non-citizens, or the ways that his work focuses on Germany, ways of thinking about the sort of notion of inclusionary incorporation, right? The sort of tenuous relationship that people who are seen to not belong continually have with the state. So just to very, very quickly give a couple examples of some of the activists I followed and worked with in this ongoing project. So first, this is Ramada Dieng, who was a 45-year-old. In June 2007, her brother, Liamin Dieng, a 25-year-old of Senegalese origin, died following a struggle with multiple police officers in the 20th arrondissement of Paris. So essentially, he was restrained face down on the street, and his hands were tied behind his back and his feet were strapped together. By the time he was then taken to a police van, and by the time he arrived at the station, he was no longer breathing. And so part of the activist work is trying to is to demand a full investigation, as well as accountability and punishment for the numerous officers that have been involved. So after her brother's death, Ramada, who's in the last slide, she started a collectif Vivole as a way to sort of mobilize others against state violence. So thinking about this, not just about the specific death of her own brother, but rather targeting this broader social problem. So through this collectif, she and other activists, align with friends and family members of other victims of police violence and hold yearly commemorative demonstrations, such as what's pictured here, and then also on the last slide, on the anniversary of Liamin's death, and that they both sort of recount the specific events that led up to his death, and also allow other family members and friends of other victims to recount their testimonies as well. So it becomes a sort of like collective experience. So one of the times when I was meeting with her, she explained to me the contours of this issue, saying, quote, "Police violence in France really is a racial question. It is racism of the state. Because when you look at the list of victims, you see that essentially more than 90% are Blacks and Arabs. The remaining 10% are activists or militants, Roma, and what we say in quotation marks as accidents. Whites only die by accident because they are not targeted, they are not the profile. There's a kind of profile for police violence, and the profile of victims is always the same profile. It is always young Black men between 20 and 40 years old, and Maghreb men as well, between 20 and 40 years old," end quote. So what's crucial that I want to emphasize here is that Ramada became an activist following the death of her brother, but also sees, this is also as a particularly, not just a racialized issue, but also a gendered issue, and thinks about the ways in which, she understands the hyper-surveillance by the police affecting her community more through the experiences of the men in her life as versus her own individual experiences. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Another quick example I want to raise is Assa Traoré, who is pictured here under a photo of her brother, Adama Traoré, who in July 2016 died under what can be considered unusual circumstances after being arrested in a banlieue north of Paris. So the police first claimed that he died of a heart attack, and then later said he had an infection. And so there's been multiple explanations for his death that Assa and the rest of her family have challenged. So one of the things that's sort of interesting about the case of Assa Traoré is she's received much media attention, both sort of nationally within France and then internationally as well. So, before her brother's death, she also was not considered an activist, or she didn't consider herself an activist, but was working as a teacher's assistant. Since her brother's death, she's written 2 books, the sales of which she uses to seek justice for her brother, which include paying legal fees for 4 of her other brothers who've been arrested since her brother's death. And so she's made this point publicly that her family has been under attack by the French state ever since she and others have contested the official explanation for Adama's death. So the point here being that this is not just violence against, the sort of the death of Adama, it's rather to the whole family and communities in the 5 years since Adama Traoré was killed. Okay, so just, specifically in the last year or so, she's become a major activist and one of the people seen on the forefront of this movement against state violence in France. She regularly gives talks about her brother's death and the broader phenomena of racism, not just in France, but all over the world. And she, has said that she sees this as a movement, not just contesting the death of her brother, but for all, what she terms forgotten populations in French society.
Jean, I'm sorry to interrupt, 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So again, one of the things that she said in one of our conversations is, quote, "We don't see people like Adama as a human, a son, a brother. Even I've been controlled in these quartiers." So even controlled as in stopped by the police. "What's happening is France is having an identity crisis. It wants to suppress differences, but you can't do that," end quote. Okay, so just to sort of briefly wrap up a lot of stuff I sort of very quickly ran through. So I think, thinking about the sort of movement against state violence, I think it's crucial, and also just in the context of this symposium, to think about what it means to center Black women, to think about sort of the long history and arc of Black feminism, not just in the United States, but specifically in Europe, and what it means for, Black women to be on the forefront of this movement against state violence, both and as understanding it both as a racialized issue or racialized phenomena, but also as a gendered phenomena, thinking about the sort of different men and their communities in their neighborhoods who are targeted by the state, who are seen as dangerous, who are therefore targeted by the police, who are heavily surveilled, et cetera. And so thinking about, what does it mean to think about men as predominantly victims and women as predominantly leading that struggle. The other thing I want to kind of go back to is thinking about, how this matters, is that often, just thinking about these questions through solely a race or gender lens renders Black women invisible, or which is why I think, it's so crucial to keep in mind the role that Black women are playing in this movement, and why that matters, and why that's particularly seen as threatening to the sort of French way of order of things. It's also really interesting to think about sort of this, and I think this gets to broader questions of sort of who gets to be French, who gets to be seen as part of French society outside of how they might identify themselves. So I didn't have much time to get into it in this presentation, but one of the things I think is really interesting in this movement is thinking about how women like Ramada and Asa are making claims to the state as French individuals versus identifying outside of the state, right? They're indicting the state for this phenomenon, for this violence, as members of French society, even as they're excluded or not seen as French by their compatriots, by other French people. Again, so thinking about, again, just another sort of point to sort of maybe end with is thinking about, how do these activists challenge questions of racism in a state context in which race and ethnicity are not seen as tenable as state categories. What does it mean to do anti-racist work without this sort of racial framework, or the official racial framework? And then finally, to think about, how not just in France, but sort of, around the world, we can think about how state violence, or how the state is doing particular work to, again, mark who is always under suspicion and who is not, and therefore who can fully be seen, be included in mainstream society. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Jean. Please remember that you can type in your questions. So let me just check whether we have any questions.
And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Jean. So, okay, I can ask a question if I'm allowed. All right, so Jean, if I'm correct, cultural citizenship functions as an analytical framework in your work. And I was wondering, how useful do you think it is in relation to acknowledging women's intersectional marginalization and exclusion, given that although women have been rendered as symbols and carriers of culture historically, and especially non-white women, they have been excluded from notions of citizenship, right? And I'm thinking about what Yavel Davis described as women's citizenship being of a dualistic nature. So that's my question. Thank you.
So the question is sort of how can women be seen? I'm sorry, I think I missed the actual question.
I'm sorry. Would you like me to repeat that question?
Yeah, can you just repeat that? Yeah, the last part.
Yeah. How useful do you think the cultural citizenship as an analytical framework is? How useful it is when we think about women, and particularly women who are not white, since women have been defined historically both as symbols and carriers of culture, but also as the others of culture. They're supposed to be transmitting, and they're excluded from it.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that question. So, I mean, I think it's really interesting. In some ways, I think, Black women can sort of be almost like canaries in the coal mine to a lot of these questions, and thinking about the ways that like they are, so let me back up. So I'm thinking about the ways that, women of color in France are often seen as the population that can be saved, or thinking about Muslim women as a population that can be saved from quote unquote dangerous Muslim men. And so I think there's a way that I think that in that sort of framework of women as being sort of in need of saving in a general sense, I think then when you think about that as it relates to the experiences of the women I've described in my presentation, it's interesting to think about how the fact that they still are not included reveals how problematic or how pervasive this question of exclusion based on race really is in French society, because they should be the population that is seen to be more easily assimilable, for lack of a better way of putting that. So I think it's actually, there's a sort of way in which I think Black women can be seen as canaries in the coal mine for understanding how questions of inclusion and exclusion work more broadly. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I can see we have more questions for you, Jean. The first one is, what steps are useful towards stopping the racial marginalization which you describe in your work?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's kind of $1 million question. So I mean, I think part of it, I could spend the next 3 hours talking about this, but I think part of what's interesting about the context of France is thinking, and the sort of specifically how one combats racial marginalization is thinking about the role of state level categories. So I think, one of the things that's come out of this movement is a need, or sort of a struggle to fight against state violence, to fight against police brutality without any sense of official statistics. And so I think sometimes when I get this question, I think to myself, well, the first immediate way of thinking about this is changing the discourse around official categories, around racial categories, so that there is a more sort of kind of broader way to document these issues of sort of discrimination or harassment by the police. That's not a complete answer, because of course, we have those categories here in the United States, and that has not done anything for stopping racial marginalization, very simply put. So I think the categories only go so far, but that does seem to be one of the initial ways of thinking through how to best address these issues. Awesome.
Thank you, Jean. And we have time for another question, a question posed by my colleague, Michalis Moutselos, who says, can you talk a bit more about the notion of suspect citizenship? Is it the activists that are suspicious of the French idea of citizenship, or is it state agents that peel layers of citizenship of the victims of police violence? What do you think the concept adds to more standard critiques of French colorblindness?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, I want to clarify. I think it's that the different levels of the state, or different agents of the state, as you put it, are the ones constructing this suspect citizenship. So in other words, constructing not just, so for example, as I mentioned in my presentation, I initially was using, or I've used the framework of cultural citizenship to understand, who's actually seen as being able to be fully included. But as I've been doing this work on state violence and activism against state violence, I think that the question of citizenship is much more, I think cultural citizenship is almost sometimes a too benign way of putting it. So I think that there really is a construction of suspicious subjects, or suspicious populations, and the sort of specter of police violence is one of the mechanisms that's reinforcing that. And so I think to your point around or to your question around the concept of what does this add to sort of critiques of color blindness, I'm really interested in thinking about not just, again, like the specific incidents of police violence, but actually more just sort of what the sort of specter or threat of police violence does to construct these populations. So then it becomes less about who the specific victims are, or how many Black people are killed by the police, and more about how individuals in particular communities know that certain populations are killed by the police, and that structures how they understand their relationship to the state more generally. So that's how I'm trying to think about it. So I think there's been a lot of work, particularly the last few years, around thinking about the French police as an institution, and the sort of ways that they are not as colorblind as the French ideal would suggest. I'm thinking about the work of GDA Fasson, for example. And so I'm sort of connected to that work to think about like what that does for people for just ordinary citizens who aren't parts of the police and aren't white. So that's kind of where I'm trying to come in to those questions. So hopefully that addressed your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you so very much. Thank you. That was great. So I think that there are no other questions. Is that right? We don't have any other questions, right? Okay, so I think that now we can proceed to Phillip M. Ayoub, who is Associate Professor of Diplomacy and World Affairs at Occidental College and Associate Editor at the European Journal of Politics and Gender. His research bridges insights from international relations and comparative politics, engaging with literature on transnational politics, gender and politics, norm diffusion, and the study of social movements. Alongside several articles, he's the author of When States Come Out, Europe's Sexual Minorities and the Politics of Visibility, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. And he's also co-editor with David Paternotte of LGBT Activism and the Making of Europe, published by Palgrave in 2014. The title of Philip's presentation is Pride Amid Prejudice, the Impact of LGBT plus rights activism in a socially conservative society. And it's based on a paper he co-authored with Douglas Page and Sam Whitt. So Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today with some of my favorite scholars getting together, even in this virtual world. It's really a really great way to wake up this morning here in California, and also for all of your hard work, Naya, putting this together and bringing us together. And we're really grateful. This paper was actually done, was conducted around a Pride event that took place actually shortly before the COVID pandemic. And I can talk a little bit in the Q&A about how how that has shifted now in this new environment of the pandemic and how that's affected Pride. And it's a little bit different than some of my earlier work on intersectionality specifically, but we thought in talking about what I should present today that this would get at some of the themes of this panel in terms of how activists navigate particularly difficult situations. And in this one, given the high levels of homo and transphobia in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the Pride parade took place. And so what I'm going to talk about is the results of a study where we did an experiment around the first ever Pride in Sarajevo, which is actually the last one of these events in a European capital city, or the last country to host one of these events in Europe. And looking at, trying to measure how people felt about LGBTI communities before and after the event took place. And so that's what I'll be speaking about. And again, this was a study conducted with Sam Whitt and Douglas Page, who are not here with us this morning. So I want to, before I start, I just want to give a little bit of context about what Pride is. And we just had this year the 51st anniversary of the first ever Pride March, which was conducted in New York City to commemorate police riots of the year before, took place in 1969, surrounding riots at New York City's Stonewall Inn. And it was, that first Pride demonstration in 1970 that ushered in this new generation of LGBTQ activism called gay liberation, which was really defined by its visibility and the notion that, coming out and coming into the streets could transform the lived experience of queer people as well as those around them. And, that innovation that was developed there, it spread to multiple countries with thousands of new queer organizations emerging in the decade that followed. In Germany, for example, the event itself are called CSDs, or Christopher Street Days, in homage to the street where the Stonewall Inn was located. And, they traveled to these different places, but despite their different manifestations, they've become this kind of enduring fixture of LGBTQ visibility, identity, and community. Yet while we've done a lot of case studies, ethnographic case studies, we haven't looked so closely at and actually tried to measure their effect or the effect of these movement performances on social tolerance and political participation by ordinary citizens in the communities where they take place. And that's a little bit what we were trying to do with this particular study, where we looked at the question of what are the outcomes of Pride in terms of social tolerance and political participation, and does an event like this generate support for LGBT plus people and activism on their behalf. And we look at that in two different ways. One, we try to measure changes in attitudes in the general population toward LGBT plus activism. And then we also actually look in a kind of a survey experiment, we look at the willingness and the propensity to actually participate in such activism. And there's a theoretical motivation before kind of the practical motivation that I'll talk about on the next slide. And the theoretical motivation is really comes from the social movement literature, contentious politics literature, in that several recent reviews of the field have really lamented the fact that we don't have enough scholarship in contentious politics that involves isolating the effects of social movement performances on opinion and behavioral change. And so scholars have complained that the field has devoted little systematic effort to account for the impact of advocacy on the communities where it takes place, with looking at this in terms of public opinion. And so we thought that was kind of a useful, that LGBT plus Pride might be a useful way to contribute in that area. And then we also were really, I think at least for me, a central motivation was a debate in the literature around Pride itself, with different views on the utility of this movement performance, where some scholars really feel strongly that prides are front and center as the most visible mobilizations that have allowed people to live out their identities more than before. They've been seen as generating visibility, recognition, bestowing legitimacy on LGBTQ communities, and having a unique ability to respond to opponent groups, to potentially capture hearts and minds, and also to mobilize sustained political participation by LGBTQ people themselves. At the same time, there's also been, the other side of this debate has also focused on the potential of Pride to inadvertently produce invisibility, to invisibilize certain members of LGBTI communities, to potentially also increase repression and violence against them, and to delegitimize them. And this has a lot to do with themes that we're also talking about here, that early radical notions of Pride were as a political demonstration, and really having intersectionality and inclusivity as a core feature of the event have, in some contexts, feels like this has slipped away as these events have become more commercialized. They've become more geared towards the most privileged in the LGBTI community, and we've seen that also actually with surveys that more financially privileged folks are able to participate in events like this, or choose to participate in them, and that many more people feel less included. And also there's a concern that prides are insensitive to the cultural context, in that they are originated in the West and have really developed there. And so thus, as they travel to other countries, they can be capable of provoking increased violence towards LGBTI people. And they might really fuel this debate that LGBT plus rights are a kind of foreign imposition on and an infringement of the domestic sovereignty of the countries with which they travel to. So this debate, is there for a reason, and I think the findings are really heterogeneous and complex that we have to think about carefully with this kind of work. And this actually leads to our argument, in which we try to draw mechanisms from both the Pride optimist and skeptic camps to theorize that the effects of Pride might be interactive and that they might operate in different ways across geography and social group. And so we argue actually that Prides could potentially work to influence their communities through this contact, that was originally theorized by raising the awareness of LGBT plus people and shifting cultural norms through the celebration of queer life and thus legitimizing LGBTI people's presence in the public space. Yet we want to acknowledge that Pride effects are likely not uniform across society. They might vary in reach according to a person's proximity to the event itself, and also according to their contact with LGBT plus social networks. And this impact might really, proximity might really matter for this, that the felt intensity of the visibility of Pride might not travel around further than around the event itself. So there might be ununiform effects of this event. And beyond this, who it reaches matters as well. So many people may hold negative beliefs about LGBT plus people, and they might see prides as threatening to the social order. And in particular, prior research underscores how religiosity and ethno-nationalism play an important role in explaining who will have an adverse response to pride events and potentially perceive LGBT people as a threat to the fixedness of the social and moral order. And so thus, while pride effects may be amplified by proximity and contact with LGBT plus social networks, diffusion might also be bounded by religiosity and ethno-nationalism. And so we look at this, or these ideas produce kind of two hypotheses, is that if looking at attitudinal change, that we expect that prides could increase support for LGBT plus activism, but that this effect might be circumscribed in that by proximity, that prides may have a greatest effect on the individuals in close proximity to the event. We also, which I don't have time to talk about during the presentation, but in the Q&A, we do also look at the propensity to participate and also provide financial support for these events, and I can talk about that in the Q&A. We do this study in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which we define as a socially conservative society or a difficult context. And I want to note that, all the societies we live in are socially conservative for LGBT people. We define this we define this one as socially conservative in that it has both a comparatively high level of homo and transphobia in terms of its attitudes, and it is a context where LGBT plus communities are still relatively new in the domestic discourse. So in the most recent survey data, over 80% of people felt that homosexuality, for example, is never justifiable, and 77% of respondents reported having zero feelings of closeness with gay people on a scale of 0 to 10. So it is one where we see really high levels of social conservatism towards the communities that are represented in this pride. And then furthermore, Bosnia-Herzegovina is a hard case in that it's a post-conflict society, which reflects these conditions of heightened ethnic nationalism and religiosity that scholars theorize should correspond with these low levels of support for LGBT plus activism. And of course, we see these, these heightened levels through divisions among Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks. At the same time, Bosnia-Herzegovina is also seeking broader integration into the European Union in the future, which means that that the state is also confronted with certain LGBT plus rights standards that is involved in that process. So we thought it's a quite interesting interesting case to look at. And the case itself was also really a fascinating case of organizing by really inspiring activists who organized this Pride event with the goal of shedding light on the experience of discrimination And the event took place on September 8th, 2019. And the motto of the event was "We want to come out," which roughly translates or resonates locally as a play on words for what I was told is what you yell to the driver to get off the bus. We want to get off, or we want to come out. And the official name was purposely selected as Bosnia-Herzegovina Pride to emphasize that the message was intended for the whole country, that it was not just a Sarajevo event. The Pride itself drew an estimated 3,000 marchers, which is relatively large for a first event like this. And based on our interviews, those attending the Pride March really described a joyful experience of empowered protesters interacting with onlookers and passionately waving and blowing kisses at people who stopped to look at the march. And there were some smaller counter-protesters organized the day of and the day prior, but they didn't detract from what a lot of organizers said was a really empowering experience. And one of the speeches given by an activist there, which I just want to quote a short snippet from, because it kind of, I think, can take you to that place. She said, "We are aware that this first march will not change the world, and we are aware that there are many LGBTIQ persons who, even after it ends, will not be able to tell the people closest to them who they really are. But we know that this march, this struggle, will give them the strength and hope that change can happen. This march gives us strength and faith that it will start a process of breaking prejudice against us. We are here, we exist, and we are not a threat to anyone. We are part of society, and we have the right to be equal citizens," end quote.
5 minutes, Philip. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right, so we did, I'm going a little slow this morning. So we did this looking with a pre-post treatment design where we basically measured attitudes in the city and in the country before and after the event, in the weeks before and weeks after. And the results are pretty interesting in that, and what you can see here, these are, in this figure, we see actually that there's quite little movement on public opinion outside of Sarajevo, which are those two sets of bars on the right. The opposition to the event remained largely unchanged at about 65% opposed. However, inside Sarajevo, there's a nearly 10% drop in strong opposition from before to after the Pride. So this suggests that the Pride could have a positive impact on reducing opposition and raising support for LGBT activism in proximity to where it took place. And more symbolically, the Pride actually flipped public opinion in Sarajevo in the direction of LGBT plus support, because it took the strongly and somewhat supports to over 50%. So overall, that's consistent with our first hypothesis that we find evidence of Pride, of a Pride effect on increasing LGBT plus activist support, but it appears limited to those in proximity to the event itself. And we look at a series of other controls, and we see that in this figure here, that LGBT plus contact and support, which is an index measuring support for LGBT rights in general, closeness to LGBT people and contact with LGBT people, that has an independent effect on supporting, being supportive of activism, as does being aware of the Pride. Support for EU integration is also significant in a positive direction, as theorized, signaling the potential of pro-EU sentiment working in the opposite direction of nationalism. Also, people who identify as Bosniak Serbs and to a lesser degree Croats are also less supportive of LGBT activism than those with the superordinate identity of Bosnian or others, folks who are less attached to to national identity groups. In contrast, there's a persistent negative effect of ethno-nationalism and religiosity in support for Pride. I want to just use my very last minutes to talk briefly about why this might be happening. We did 6 post-treatment interviews with activists, and they really explained that they saw a mechanism of change in that Pride allowed people to see us. They were confronted with the fact that these stereotypes didn't hold, and they helped portray a positive picture of what was happening. But they did warn that they felt that this might diminish with distance, that Pride, I quote, Pride had an especially positive impact on those that were physically closer to it, people in Sarajevo region were more confronted with it and thus compelled to form an opinion on it compared to others. So even though it was called Bosnia-Herzegovina Pride, it was de facto Sarajevo Pride. People in places far away from Sarajevo could go about their regular life without dealing with it. And this mechanism worked in a few ways, of course, onlookers interacting and seeing the march, but two, also because the parade route caused a kind of disruption in that, people couldn't go to their work without having to figure out a new way to get to it, to circumvent the parade route, or to use a different form of transportation, which activists actually saw positively in that it made everyone in Sarajevo itself have a conversation at the dinner table, and then you find out that your kids might feel differently about it, or that your neighbor might be going to the event, etc. People were also only visible around the march themselves because, for security reasons, anything like wearing a rainbow flag t-shirt or something, organizers specifically asked that people only put on those symbols when they were in the safety of the route itself with the group, and then take them off at the end of it. So in a way, that visibility didn't travel with the marchers anywhere else due to important security concerns. And then also the quantity and quality of the media coverage, which I can talk about in the Q&A, seemed to dissipate with distance. So I think I'm going to just end with this quote. And where one organizer said, "It is always a struggle to have a first pride, but then it happens and people wake up in the morning and they find that life has not changed, purity in society has not been overthrown, and leaders of the church are still leaders of the church, and that's why pride matters." This is a kind of optimistic quote to end on. I'm not going to go over all of the very difficult organizing and all of the risks that are involved in this activism that still lead us to think about this quite cautiously, but I'll be happy to talk about it now in the Q&A. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you so very much. And well, we already have a question for you, Philip. That's from Pete, a former student of mine. He says, "Thanks a lot to Philip for the presentation. How would you reflect on this urban and rural divide? We in the youth sector have quite much noticed that lack of public interest and funding in rural areas does have a negative impact on activists in rural areas. Yet when support and structure are put in place, then we do notice a remarkable change within the rural areas. A great example in Cyprus is Agros village and their activism around youth and social issues." So that's a comment / question.
Thank you, Pete, for this question. It's really important. I mean, of course, there's a lot of research showing this urban-rural divide, that urban areas can have more spaces for identity formation, leading to more activism, leading to then also more mobilization for rights. Even more urbanized countries have higher scores of LGBTI rights. But I think what you're pointing out in your question, which also provides part of the answer, is really there, in that it's not that that other areas couldn't have the potential for these events themselves. And this is something that activists actually noted here a lot, in that when we looked at it, it was really a proximity effect, in that other urban areas in the country, it's not like those areas got automatically more supportive of the Pride itself. It was really about the proximity. And when it came to reaching non-queer people, when it came to reaching other LGBTI people, these events, even though they took place in an urban area, and this is something I didn't get to talk about, was that there was this kind of interpersonal visibility among LGBTIQ people, even in rural areas, where the event had a lot further reach. They heard about the Pride, they sent messages about how this was important for them and empowering to them, and so that these events can reach queer communities to a broader degree. But there was, among the activists, really a sense that, we have to invest more in reaching other parts of the country, including rural communities. I think that applies to the US, to other European countries, but it has to be done with a lot of safety in mind. So it's not, I think the message is not to have a Pride everywhere automatically, because there's a lot of, harm that can still, that it can still produce harm and violence towards these communities. So there has to really be local organizers who in the grassroots themselves want to organize an event like this and can really advise on how to go about it with the necessary precautions in place. please email me if you want to talk more about it. I should just keep my responses a bit short.
Great, thank you very much, Philip. We have another question for you from Matthew. It's nice to have you with us, Matthew. Matthew asks you to compare your analysis with Cohen's analysis of the Belgrade Pride in Serbia.
Mm-hmm.
And he says it seems a deep analysis. Oh, I've lost it, I'm sorry. But I think he might be too negative about it. So if we could have your comments, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us and for the question. And yes, the study that Matthew is referring to is Koen Slootmaker's study on the Belgrade Ghost Pride, which we use that a lot to theorize this process here. And I actually talked with Koen a lot about this particular event as well. And we asked activists about it directly as well. And they said, you know, they wouldn't define this one as a ghost pride. The ghost pride was an interesting dynamic where the protesters were actually invisibilized themselves because they were so cordoned off from the community that and the state really used the event as a way to kind of signal its modernity vis-a-vis the European Union without really dealing with the protesters themselves. And a lot of the activists in Sarajevo were aware of that pride, had taken part in it, etc. But they said in their experience, they would call it, you know, one said, well, then I would call it a zoo pride or something because we were also cordoned off. But there was a kind of interaction with the community itself, which they found really important. So there has to be visibility and interaction with the surrounding communities. And that might have been a central difference between those two prides, which might explain why the effect was so different in this one, that they felt like they were able to maintain a kind of interaction with the surrounding communities and they were able to empower local LGBTI people. I think some of them might have learned from the Belgrade event as well in their organizing and planning.
Great. Well, thank you, Phil. I think since we have a few minutes left, I think we can maybe ask you to respond to Michali's question about whether you have recorded any effects longer term than the few weeks of the post-treatment survey.
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, so we're actually doing a follow-up study this year to see if the effects hold. The COVID pandemic did really disrupt our process a little bit, given that the 2020 Pride was virtual, as in many parts of the world. But we're following up on that now, and so I hope I can report back. And if I could just say something briefly about the shift to the virtual reality that really connects with themes of this conference, is that it did inspire a lot of activists to really push a reset button, questioning, you know, what we can learn from the original ethos of Pride, which I think the activists in Sarajevo really were able to tap into to organize a political demonstration that was an inclusive intersectional event. And I think that for many of us switching to virtual platforms, it provoked these questions, which, how do we deal with police at Pride parades, given you know, the conversations we're having in Black Lives Matter and racial justice movements? How do we deal with class in these events, given that they've become so commercialized that they're, you know, too expensive to take part in for many communities? So there's been a lot of tough questions asked, and I think that it has actually led, I mean, maybe I'm being too optimistic here, but it has led to also kind of rethinking how we organize these events in some cases. We've had in LA, where I am right now, there was a Black Lives Matter Solidarity Pride last year, and there's been many Pride organizers have tried to shift their response also in terms of how corporations get to be involved in these events, how political parties get to be involved. So I think that, you know, there has been some opportunity in this difficult time that we've had when it comes to our organizing and our thinking. And I hope that, you know, to connect to this question, that that's something that we can sustain and hold on to moving forward.
Thank you very, very much, Philip. Thank you. So I think we're now ready to move to our next presentation by Elizabeth Evans. Elizabeth Evans, her research explores the relationship between social movements, political parties, and political representation, and is framed by an intersectional theoretical approach. Her work has been funded by the ESRC, British Academy, Government Equalities Office, and she's a 2020-2021 ISRF Mid-Career Research Fellow. She's the author of 2 books. Her most recent, The Politics of Third Wave Feminism, is a comparative analysis of feminism in the UK and the US. She has published in a wide range of journals, including recently in International Political Science Review, Politics and Gender, Political Studies, and Party Politics. She co-edited Confronting Privileges, Intersectionality in Feminist and Queer Movements with Eleanor Levinar. This book was published in 2020 by Routledge. Elizabeth is editor-in-chief of Politics, a co-founding editor of the European Journal of Politics and Gender, and a former convener of both the European Conference on Politics and Gender and the PSA Women and Politics Group. The title of Liz's presentation is Intersectionality and Disability Activism, Opportunities and Challenges. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you so much. It's always nice to be introduced and reminded of stuff you were able to do in the sort of pre-COVID times when you had a lot more energy. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Naya, thank you so much for organising this terrific event. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Really enjoyed the 2 papers so far. So my talk explores how intersectionality relates to disability activism, but also how disability is a part or not of intersectional praxis, specifically feminist praxis. So what I'm going to present to you this afternoon it draws really on research that I've undertaken for various different projects over the last 5 years on disability rights activism, which I'm currently working on, and feminist activism, and specifically on feminist disability activism as well. And the research that I'll present is based on a UK case study. And the overarching kind of picture, I suppose, is that we're not quite there yet in terms of thinking about intersectionality and disability. So I suppose I wanted to start off my presentation by really reflecting on the difficult times part of this event. Obviously it's very difficult times thinking about the current context, but I suppose I wanted to start off by saying that the idea of difficult times is really nothing new for disabled people. And I'm really drawing here on Akugo Emejulu's work in light of the 2008 economic crash, in which she talked about how it wasn't a new crisis for ethnic minority women in the UK, but rather a continuation of an existing set of crises. And that's really where disabled people are in the UK context at the moment. So to put this into kind of global perspective, around 15% of the world's population are disabled, according to the World Health Organization. I would slap an extreme health warning on that data, though. We know that there are serious issues with data collection when it comes to disability, which makes actually doing research on disability quite challenging. There's an issue in terms of underreporting. Partly that's because there's such a stigma still attached to disability that people are reluctant to self-identify as disabled. There's differing definitions according to national context, which makes it harder to gather comparative data as well. So for instance, in the UK context, we have it at around 21% of the population is disabled. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, how are you defining disability? So I draw on the social model of disability, and that was developed by disability activists and also disability studies scholars in opposition to the heavily medicalized way of defining disability. So the social model of disability interprets disability as a phenomenon that's produced by society. So in the social model of disability, no one is born disabled. It's society that disables people through structures, through design, through architecture, through discourse, and through attitudes as well. So in this sense, disability is a kind of system in which people with impairments, whether that's physical, mental, cognitive, developmental, intellectual, or some combination, experience discrimination and stigma. You might have noticed that the language I'm using, I'm talking about disabled people rather than people with disabilities. I'm doing that because it's the very strong stated preference of the UK disability rights movement and disability studies scholars in a UK context to talk about disabled people rather than people with disabilities. So I recognise that many of you perhaps would use the term people with disabilities instead, but I'm using the preferred language of the UK movement, not least because I'm situated in the UK, but my work engages with and draws upon the work of UK disabled activists as well. So in terms of the kind of context and the challenges facing disabled people in the UK, we know that disabled people face much higher levels of poverty. In the UK, disabled people are 3 times more likely to experience material deprivation. Disability is both the cause and consequence of poverty as well. Disabled people in the UK experience lower levels of education. Partly that's because of the response of mainstream education. We might think about exclusion and stigma and attitudes towards disabled children as well. Higher levels of targeted violence for disabled people. There are currently campaigns in the UK to make hate crime on the basis of disability to kind of legislate for that as well, because there's been such a rise over the past few years. And so disabled people have kind of lower levels of social and cultural capital, less likely to be found in positions of power, less well networked, and so forth. So thinking about the kind of post-2008, with the caveat that I started off this slide with by saying it's kind of difficult times is a kind of continuation of crises. The economic crash led to many post-industrial economies implementing a series of harsh welfare cuts that were particularly damaging for disabled people, cuts to disability benefit and very punitive sanctions and a scapegoating really of disabled people, a sense that disabled people were trying to cheat the system. So there's a lot of demonisation in the UK concerning disabled people. Of course, thinking about COVID, which has had such a devastating effect on so many people, but in particular, disabled people have been hit the hardest. Research from China, from Australia, from the UK has demonstrated that. In a UK context, a lot of disabled people simply haven't left their home in over a year. Very much an afterthought in terms of public policy planning. In a UK context, the daily press briefings, the Prime Minister was very resistant to even having a British Sign Language interpreter along with the daily kind of press briefings. So one kind of silver lining of this difficult times is that over the last decade, there's been a real resurgence and renewal of disability rights activism. New groups have emerged, in particular more radical leftist groups like Disabled People Against the Cuts and various groups that oppose social care charging. So the disability rights movement, I would say, is going through a phase of new groups are emerging. There is new kind of energy around disability rights activism that perhaps we haven't seen for some time. So how do intersectionality and disability speak to each other? I think it would be fair to say that disability has tended to be a little bit left out of some conversations when it comes to intersectionality, especially those that kind of, necessarily have focused on the kind of the big three of gender, race, and class. And my work in this area and how I'm thinking about intersectionality and disability is really influenced by and indebted to the work of critical race theorist and disability studies scholar Nirmala Eravels, who's written extensively on disability and thinking about disability difference and intersectionality. And Eravels has conceptualized disability as an ideological condition. So disability is produced and required by capitalism. So how useful you are depends on your ability to work in and of course be exploited by the labor markets and your ability to consume, right? And when you deviate from the norm, you're effectively rendered a non-citizen. So just kind of a callback to Jean's earlier presentation when we're thinking about the idea of suspect citizenship and who counts as a citizen and a kind of useful citizen at that. So Eravels kind of examines how those who are positioned at the interstices of race, class, gender and disability are kind of presented as non-citizens. They sit outside of liberal humanist norms of what it counts as kind of a rational and useful human being. And for those who are interested in this kind of debate, I would also really recommend Stacey Clifford Simplican's work on this, which is excellent. So disabled women, and especially disabled women of colour, are marginalised within other movements as well. So if we think about Crenshaw's work on political intersectionality as our way of kind of thinking about that. So Eravels argues, and is very strong on, and I completely agree, that intersectionality in terms of theorising, but also more importantly, the praxis should do more to kind of incorporate disability into both the analysis, but also the practice of social justice organising, in order to better kind of tackle the pervasive nature of ableism, the idealisation of able-bodiedness and able-mindedness, and disableism, thinking about the discrimination that arises from structures and attitudes towards disabled people. So this research that I am drawing on, as I said at the start, draws on a number of strands of different kind of research projects that have been going on for the last few years. Thinking about how intersectionality and disability are in dialogue and what spaces they're kind of in existence. And this research that I'm kind of going to present to you today is focused on two broad questions, and they're not quite two sides of the same coin, but thinking about the role that disability plays in intersectional feminism within a UK context, and the ways in which intersectional activism is shaping the current iteration of a very vibrant UK disability rights scene. So in terms of the methods, it draws upon interviews that I've been undertaking quite a lot recently with disability rights activists, over 75 interviews and a survey of disabled women, in particular through the use of working closely with Sisters of Frida. There's a picture of them there, a disabled women's collective. It also draws a bit on previous work that I've done and work that I've done with Lydia, thinking about how organisations respond and articulate the ideas of intersectionality as well. So starting off then with disability activism, and I want to kind of start off by reflecting on some of these quotations from the interview. The first one reflects on the difficulties of having conversations around race and the resistance to interrogating and decentering whiteness within disability rights activism. In it, the interviewee recounted a conversation that they had had with a leading white male disabled activist who was kind of shutting down any attempt to talk about race, to talk about gender. And his response was, we can't talk about race, we can only talk about disability. And the response from the interviewee was just a very simple, but I exist, so where do I fit into this movement? You can't kind of shut me down in terms of the space to talk about the issues that are important to me as well, and to so many other people. And it kind of elicited a kind of a shrug and a termination of the discussion. And the second quotation, efforts to keep Black disabled people out of the conversation on liberation is an enduring practice in our community. So speaking to the kind of persistence within the movement, not to want to go beyond what disability studies scholar Dan Goodley calls the master signifier of disability, a nervousness about going beyond that and an outright hostility towards going beyond that. So the desire for unity and a kind of cohesiveness is very strong in the disability rights movement. As a group, disabled people have historically been intentionally divided through medicalized approaches to disability, which defines disability as an individual possession, right? One that you discuss with your healthcare professional rather than with a kind of collective social group. This desire has prevented many within the movement from having the kind of intersectional analysis and praxis that they both want and need. The interviewees talked about how the default subject within disability rights activism in the UK is a white man in a wheelchair, even though in the UK less than 8% of disabled people actually use wheelchairs. So this kind of sense of what the kind of typical disability rights activist kind of looks like is also reflected back by the state in its approach to thinking about disability and who counts as disabled, and also the media in terms of the imagery that they use when it comes to depicting disability, and also, I guess, within disability studies. So there's very much an emphasis on the kind of visible disabilities, on obvious impairments. This is also reflected in larger disability rights organisations, especially those that were historically set up as charities, which don't tend to be run by disabled people themselves. However, over the last few years in particular, in response to an increased kind of presence of Black Lives Matter in a UK context, we've seen many more disability rights activists engaging with the discourse of intersectionality, and especially and unsurprisingly those led by ethnic minority women. So there are signs that things are kind of changing, perhaps slightly slowly, but changing. So I was interviewing someone at the start of the summer from Inclusion London, which is a very large disability group, which is the kind of umbrella group for 70 deaf and disabled people's organisations around London. And they were telling me that they were setting up a new intersectionality course for all of the groups that they work with, who were keen to start to try and find out how they should change the way in which they're kind of working. We can also think about the kind of role of social media in revealing the political intersectionality kind of at work here in terms of the marginalization, in particular of disabled women of colour, which I'll come back on to.
Sorry to interrupt, 5 more minutes, please.
Oh, crumbs. Okay, so in terms of feminist activism, the quotations here are pretty straightforward, right? There's a sense from disabled feminist activists that they don't kind of enter into the conversation, and that disability is used by mainstream, larger feminist organizations as a way to kind of prove they're diverse. There was a clear difference in terms of the kind of feminist group that was organizing, more radical left-wing grassroots organizations were more willing to engage with disability and centralised disability within their critique of cuts to, say, domestic violence services. There's been a closure of a number of accessible refuges for disabled women as well. But there are obviously some points of contention which make it sometimes difficult for disabled feminists to feel at home within certain wider feminist spaces. I'm thinking about abortion and the kind of debates around prenatal screening in particular, as well as caring, the way in which caring is sometimes presented as a kind of burden to the rational liberal feminist ideal, right? Without any thoughts about what the women, disabled women who are cared for, feel about being positioned as a kind of burden. So this frustration with the movement has really led to the rise of autonomous organising. These two women in the photo, Kim Oliver and Jumoke Abdullahi, were really frustrated by the failure of the mainstream movement to address the issues faced by disabled women, femmes and non-binary people of colour. So they launched the Triple Cripples in 2018 to campaign, raise awareness, They're great on social media and podcasting and talking at events, so doing that work. Similarly, Disabled Women's Collective, Sisters of Frida, founded in 2014 and led by ethnic minority women, were keen to establish newer ways of organising. And interviewees with those involved kind of really highlighted the kind of relief of not having to engage in that heavy burden of educating at women's conferences about how they're defining disability and often being challenged very aggressively on their definition of disability, and not having to necessarily explain intersectionality in disability spaces as well. So pulling these threads together then, I think that, you know, political intersectionality reveals the marginalization of disabled women and disabled women of colour within feminist spaces and the disability rights movement within the UK. There are some signs that things are improving, which is fortunate and necessary. The of coalitional organising. Finally, I guess I just finish with, you know, my very firm belief about the radical, explicitly centred disability within both social movements organising, but within intersectional activism and social justice organising as a way of, not only because it's the right thing to do, but as a way of destabilising structural inequalities and exploitative systems. I'll finish on that jolly note.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was, well, actually, you're right on time. Thank you so very much. And we already have a question on your presentation. Okay. All right. So Pete says, working on issues of inclusion and accessibility, me and other colleagues and civil society organizations noticed that the pandemic did help rethink our interactions and access to services, especially the ones not disabled, meaning people who are home restrained due to the disability rather than a lockdown. How do you think we can invest in these experiences, not letting our human short-term memories take us back to previous mistakes? Thinking today's topic as well, do you believe that the digital advances we have experienced lately can help create better links and more inclusive channels, live interpretation, accessibility features, etc., for engagement between different activist groups? So this is a question by Pete. If you want to respond to that, and then we have some more questions for you, Liz. Thank you.
Great, fantastic question, Pete. Like, I'm really anxious that we're going to see like a kind of retrench away from some of the gains that we've got in terms of making meetings and organisations more accessible. The disability activists I speak with are really frightened that it's going to go back to kind of business as usual, and they will be excluded from events that they would, on conversations that they would otherwise not be able to participate in. I think what it has done is that it's really kind of strengthened kind of some of the transnational dimensions of disability rights activism. You know, people are much more aware of how to use Zoom and thinking about closed captioning and certain platforms that are more accessible than others. So I think it's had a significant effect. And certainly some activists I speak to kind of talk about how it's changed, you know, the things that they're invited to participate in, because people are now, well, it's online, so we don't have to worry about the building, so we can invite disability activists, whereas before we wouldn't, because we weren't going to hold it in an accessible way. So I'm both optimistic, but also slightly nervous that there will be a kind of push, a rush to get back to things as normal.
Lovely, thank you, Liz. We have another question for you from Gustavo. Hi, Gustavo, nice to see you. Well, nice to know you're here. So Gustavo says that he has a question which is based on the visibility of disabled people as sexual and autonomous subjects. And he asks, did you find in your research working alliances among trans feminist sex workers and sexual assistance activism for people with a disability? If yes, what has been the role of trans feminist activism in disability rights activism with regards to the feminist agenda of sexual rights? And how, if this relationship has been configuring a confrontational position to a feminist agenda that resists regulation or legalization of sex work? So
great. Oh my goodness, great question. Yeah, again, like I felt like I could go on forever. I won't. Yes, I definitely found some crossovers there, and alliances, and certainly in a UK context. I mean, I think it's fairly well known that the UK has a pretty hostile kind of white feminist resistance to intersectionality and to trans inclusion that is daily kind of published in The Guardian, which is, you know, read around the world, the kind of an acceptance of trans exclusionary feminism. And intersectionality has become bound up in that debate. And those feminists who are pushing a trans exclusionary line also kind of see intersectionality as part of the problem, right? Which has become really problematic. So there's kind of a coalition of ethnic minority feminists, disability feminists, trans feminists, sex workers, rights advocates and feminists coming together in opposition to this very powerful but vocal minority of white feminists in a UK context. So I think that there's definitely possibilities there, and it's I guess it's not being explored in the kind of in the pages of one of the world's biggest media sites, because that's got a particular position on these things. But yeah, I definitely came across some of those coalitional organizing.
great, thank you, Liz. I think we have we have time for, I guess, one more question or maybe two. And here's a question by Stavros. Stavros is an undergraduate student of mine, and he asks whether you think that disability rights activism relates to social class, and whether it is activism carried out by the upper classes that it's more accepted, more listened to than when it comes from the lower socioeconomic strata.
Definitely, I think that the intersection between disability and class is really, really strong. The overwhelming majority of disabled activists who I interview, who I work with, are living, if not in poverty, then have experienced very, very serious poverty. The connection between the two in a UK context is very, very clear. So I would say that where you see people from maybe a middle class or more economically comfortable social kind of position speaking on disability is those who are leading up the big disability charities, which get a lot of kind of resistance from the grassroots disability activists for not including disabled people in their advocating, right? It's a kind of continuation of a very kind of charity-based model to disability, where you kind of, you know, you feel sorry for disabled people, you go out collecting money for disabled people, rather than thinking about the way in which the state responds to disability as a kind of as a set of policy priorities. But yeah, that's a really good point, really good question.
Thank you, Liz. We do have, you know, a couple of minutes left, and I think it's important to try to address Athanasia's question. Essentially, Athanasia asks, what is our responsibility when the beast is within the walls? And Athanasia is starting, you know, from a premise that ableism is thriving at senior level and in white male academia, in our own institutions, that contradicts and cancels our work. So I guess this is, I mean, I agree that this is a very important issue to address.
Yeah, I mean, I should say there's a brilliant book that's been published called Ableism in Academia that I went to the book launch of a couple of months ago, and I've got a PDF of the entire book. So if anyone wants a PDF of that book, I know the authors would be very happy for me to send it out. So if you drop me an email, I will send it to you. But I mean, the stories in there just reflect the constant kind of ableism, this sense of what constitutes a productive academic within the neoliberal institution. Yeah, I mean, that kind of resistance to talking about disability, I hear it from my colleagues in relation to disabled students, dismissive comments about staff members, thinking about how you as an individual are expected to work productively within a highly ableist academy. I think it's absolutely critical to address that and to acknowledge it.
All right, Liz, thank you so very much. Thank you. Well, right on time. Wow, you're amazing at that. Now we can give the floor to Lydia Ayame Hiraide, who is a doctoral researcher in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her research thinks intersectionally about contemporary environmental activism in the UK and in France. She holds an MA in postcolonial studies from the University of Kent, where she was a recipient of the Ian Gregor Scholarship. Her alma mater also includes SOAS, University of London, Sciences Po Paris, and the Conservatoire for Dance and Drama. Lydia was a co-editor of postgraduate literary journal Literae Mentis from 2020 to 2021, and is an editor of politics since August 2021. Her doctoral research is funded by the Consortium for the Humanities and the Arts Southeast England, AHRC, and she has an article forthcoming in Journal of European Studies. And Lydia's presentation is titled Intersectionality in Times of Ecological Crisis. So Lydia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Naya, and thank you so much for organising this event. And I've learned so much already from listening to the previous speakers, and I hope I can also add something interesting to this discussion about intersectionality and activism in difficult times. I have lots I want to say, so I guess I'll just jump straight in. And I've got three main questions that are kind of going to be framing what I'm going to be speaking about over the next 20 minutes. And so often when I meet people and I introduce myself and I talk about what I'm researching, the first question that people ask me is, how is intersectionality relevant to climate and environmental activism? And so my doctoral research looks at environmental and climate activism in France and in the UK through this intersectional lens. And I want to kind of spend a little bit of time making a case for its relevance, the relevance of this Black feminist framework to this social movement, but then indeed social movements more generally. And then I want to spend a little bit of time looking at how climate and environmental activists in the UK context are responding to intersectionality, whether that's the mobilization of the framework or a rejection or ignorance of intersectionality. And as I said, I'll be drawing mostly from the UK context to think about this. And then I kind of want to also think about one of the spaces in which this discussion about intersectionality and environmentalism is very live, which is the internet. And so I want to explore some of the challenges and opportunities that are associated with having these discussions on the internet, and particularly in parts of the internet that have a very wide reach. And so places like Vogue or Marie Claire, these fashion magazines. So what does it mean to talk about intersectionality and environmentalism in this popular context? And so in the spirit of thinking about intersectionality in difficult times, I want to think about what that means. And so I'll be drawing mostly on Kimberlé Crenshaw's articulation of political intersectionality, which Liz mentioned in her presentation. So thinking about whose voices are heard within social movements, how they frame the concerns that they fight for and the issues that they see as relevant, and then how they organize on a practical level. And so I'm thinking both about narratives that social movements build and practices and how they relate to intersectionality. And so the context that I'm speaking from, well, as you'll know, ecological degradation and climate breakdown are emerging as pressing issues, and millions of people, mainly in the global south, are already directly experiencing extreme weather events and other effects which are caused by global heating and ecological degradation. And it's women of colour who are often bearing the brunt of these events in disproportionate ways. And so the sixth assessment report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which you can see the cover of here, reports that every year during 2015 to 2020 has likely been warmer than any prior year on record, and that 2021 is likely to finish as one of the 7 hottest years ever recorded. And so whilst environmental issues are not new to human history or human experiences, there's a particular form of large-scale environmental consciousness which has emerged. And in this consciousness, climate breakdown and ecological degradation are being viewed through the lens of crisis. And so the data from the latest round of the European Social Survey tells us that climate change skepticism is now a minority view in Europe. And so we can say that the debate about environmental issues is shifting away from whether climate change and ecological breakdown are happening and more towards what should be done about it and by whom. And so here in the UK, environmental politics have gained particular prominence, and to be pro-environmental is no longer to be on the fringes of mainstream politics as it was perhaps a half century ago. And so polls indicate that public concern over climate and environmental issues are at their highest level in nearly 30 years. And the environment is now cited, according to Ipsos Mori, as the second biggest issue facing Britain, according to the British public, with number 1 being coronavirus. And once upon a time, this number 1 spot was held by Brexit. So it's really interesting to think about how these number 1 spots change, but you've got this kind of climate and environmental public concern bubbling away and growing there. And of course, underwriting all of this is a very dynamic, loud and visible green activism, which has been met by state hostility and criminalization of this activism. And so in the UK, this looks like putting environmental groups on lists of groups with extremist ideologies and being categorized by the police as terrorists, and with protests being banned. And so sometimes at grave costs, environmental activists have succeeded in putting their issues on the agenda. And nonetheless, there are questions about the ways that green activists do this work. And these questions come from a range of sources, ranging from academia to the media and newspapers to amongst activists themselves. So there is this internal reflection and conversation going on about the ways that green activists do their organizing and whether the ways that they work can be exclusionary. And so one group which has received a lot of this criticism is Extinction Rebellion UK. And if you're not already familiar with Extinction Rebellion, they are a decentralized network of environmental activists, which was founded in the UK in 2018. And they use non-violent civil disobedience tactics to protest what they refer to as mass extinction and social collapse. And so if we're thinking about the importance of intersectionality in social movements, it's interesting to examine some of the critiques that have been leveled against Extinction Rebellion. And I don't want to disparage the work that XR are doing, because they've managed to generate a really live conversation in this country about environmental issues. But as critics have noted, there are some questions that have to be posed about the ways that they do this sometimes. And so here again, I'm thinking about narrative, both narrative and practice. And so in late 2019, another collective called Wretched of the Earth, who are obviously invoking Frantz Fanon there with the name of their collective, wrote an open letter to Extinction Rebellion, kind of challenging the ways that Extinction Rebellion frames environmental issues. And according to Wretched of the Earth, I'm quoting them here, in order to envision a future in which we will all be liberated from the root causes of the climate crisis, capitalism, extractivism, racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and other systems of oppression, the climate movement must reflect the complex realities of everyone's lives in their narrative. And so these concerns about the ways that a group like Extinction Rebellion might frame their activism come from this kind of critique which sees climate and environmental issues as tied up with kind of existing social forms of oppression. And so there's this kind of awareness that environmental discourses and strategies which don't take stock of this social aspect of climate crisis can further feed into policies that reinscribe unequal relations of power, can exclude people from joining the movement and alienate groups that are already marginalized in society. In terms of practice, a lot of the conversation about Extinction Rebellion crystallizes around XR's relationship with the police. And so there was an instance in which an XR activist who was arrested for their activism in Brixton sent flowers to the police station afterwards and thanked the police. And this kind of generated a lot of discomfort for communities, racialized communities in London who are over-policed, and especially given that in the past there have been people of colour who've died at those very police stations. And so there's also been instances where XR have asked for the police to focus on tackling knife crime rather than their protests. And we know the ways that this kind of discourse of knife crime have been used to target racialized communities. And so these examples kind of illustrate how the groups who are already bearing the heaviest environmental burden can be further alienated from environmental politics, which is kind of indifferent to the politics of human difference and structural oppression. But the story of green politics and intersectionality in the UK is not only one of kind of insensitivity or rejection or ignorance of intersectionality. There are groups who are really embracing this idea of intersectionality to frame their activism. And so I want to pivot to think about another group, a slightly smaller group called BP or Not BP. And BP or Not BP is a UK-based theatre group which campaigns against the sponsorship of the oil giant British Petroleum, BP, in cultural organisations. And so the group has staged more than 60 protest performances in and around cultural organisations. And so including a disobedient tour of the British Museum called the Striking Back at the Empire Tour, which kind of makes the links between objects in the museum, colonialism, and BP sponsorship. And so to give you an idea of BP's role within culture in the UK, BP is currently sponsoring the British Museum, the Royal Opera House, National Portrait Gallery, and Science Museum, amongst other organisations. And so BP or Not BP demands that cultural institutions divest from BP sponsorship and sever their connection with what they describe as the corporation's appalling environmental and human rights record and its considerable contribution to climate change. And so in their statement of values, BP or Not BP echo ecofeminists in emphasizing and historicizing the disproportionate burdens of fossil fuel fallout on global South countries, and particularly the women and people of color within those countries. And so they effect an analysis which kind of emphasizes the way that individuals experience structural oppression and violence, and they kind of historicize these experiences in really interesting ways. So we can see the way that intersectionality can encourage us to think about who is affected by environmental and climate issues, how these people are affected, and why these people are affected in this way. So for me, this is also a step to thinking about what kind of solutions would avoid re-inscribing these forms of violence and oppression. And so it's a descriptive, explanatory, and normative assessment of environmental issues, which avoids this kind of sometimes historic tendency within the environmental movement to slip into more universalistic or homogenizing narratives which describe climate and environmental issues. But as Patricia Hill Collins argues, intersectionality is not simply a discourse to master, but it's a political tool. So when we think about how intersectionality informs activist practices, BP or Not BP are also a really interesting group to think about in terms of the Safer Spaces Agreement that they have in place. And so the Safer Spaces Agreement is a document that all new members of the group must agree to when they join the group. And it's there in order to recognize some of the oppressions and the kind of difficulties that exist already within the group on a group level. And so the group have a Safer Spaces working group in place to kind of deal with any incidents or complaints or difficulties in a way that kind of tends to the interconnections between oppression and power and the way that groups can organize. And so I think it's a really interesting practical mobilization of intersectionality to ensure that activist organizing is inclusive and radically inclusive. And I want to pivot now to think a little bit about another space in which this kind of environmentalist engagement with intersectionality is taking place, and that's the internet. And so, as I mentioned, a lot of this discussion about intersectionality and environmentalism is taking place online, and particularly in social media. What I find really interesting as well is that the term intersectional environmentalism is one which appears to enjoy far greater usage amongst popular publications and social media than within academia, for example. And so digital modes of activism have been rubbished as kind of nothing more than slacktivism, this kind of less engaged, less impactful and less meaningful political form of action. But I think that actually that's a bit unfair to digital activism. And I think particularly in our moment, thinking about the coronavirus pandemic, digital actions are really increasingly important and impactful and an interesting place to look to when we're thinking about discussions, particularly around intersectionality and environmentalism. And so what you can see on the screen here is a screen grab from the Instagram account Intersectional Environmentalist, which was launched last year by the US environmental activist Leah Thomas. And so it kind of functions as a resource hub which uses colorful graphics, infographics to educate people on issues relating to the intersections of social and environmental justice. And something that's really interesting about intersectional environmentalists as well is the way in which they've kind of entered into partnerships with corporations, with large organizations, with outlets from the mainstream media in order to have this wider conversation with a wide reach. But I think there are lots of challenges that emerge from engaging in and mobilizing intersectional frameworks of activism in these spaces, which are kind of spaces that are not necessarily radical and emancipatory spaces in and of themselves. And so I'm drawing on the work of scholars Ulhak, Lone and Ashraf, who have developed this kind of framework of co-optation to think about the ways that ideas which are originally conceived as emancipatory and often from the margins, the ways that they can come to be emptied of their radical political vigor and then simply co-opted as signifiers of diversity, inclusion, and tolerance, and even refashioned and commercialized for profit. And so as these processes of co-optation take place, this radical, deeper structural change that is sought by activists doesn't take place. And so I want to think about this notion of co-optation in the context of the proliferation of conversations about intersectional environmentalism. So what does it mean that there is this popular diffusion of intersectional vocabulary in the green context? Does it remove intersectionality from its original radical Black feminist politics? And how effective is this discussion in teasing out the social interlinkages of oppression and violence that form the context of ecological crisis?
5 minutes, sorry to interrupt.
Yes, thank you, Naya. So yes, I guess this article in Marie Claire is a really interesting example because we can think about what it means that a magazine like Marie Claire publishes articles declaring that intersectional environmentalism is the urgent way forward, and in the same space, alongside articles that are titled Kate Middleton's favourite 65-pound jeans are back in stock, where the jeans in question are from a high street fast fashion label, and in this instance, a fast fashion label owned by H&M, who almost none of their supply chain is certified by labour standards which ensure workers' health and safety or other labour's rights. It provides no evidence that it ensures payment of a living wage to its workers in most of its supply chain, and even though it set targets to reduce its generation of CO2 emissions, it hasn't provided any evidence on how it's going to do this or whether it's doing this already. So this is not to disparage the kind of diversity of topics that one popular publication can publish, but I think it's interesting to ask questions about how, when cited in this context, intersectionality can become removed from the radical, political, anti-capitalist project of Black feminism. And additionally, the content of the article caters largely to topics of diversity and political representation, which is largely about thinking about adding people from marginalized communities into established forms of decision-making, whilst the actual cultures, the norms, and the processes themselves remain unchanged. And so I guess I want to ask what it means to kind of have this intersectional vocabulary pushed by activists into spaces like Marie Claire, whilst the space itself remains pretty much unchanged. But I don't want to be too critical, because I think often about the way that I came to call myself a feminist, and how kind of cheesy girl power pop music and teenage magazines had a really important part to play in kind of introducing this language to someone like myself. And so I wonder whether there's this kind of tension between depoliticization, as many scholars have argued, of the concept of intersectionality, versus this potential democratization and popular diffusion of a really important Black feminist framework. And so I have had a lot of ideas there to explore, and so I just want to wrap up in kind of returning to the three main questions which I posed at the beginning of this 20 minutes. And so the first being, why is intersectionality relevant to climate and environmental activism? I hope I've illustrated that intersectionality is generally a crucial social justice tool for social movements, for ensuring that social movements speak for the people that they say they speak for, and they do this in ways that kind of disrupts processes of violence, of oppression, of silencing, of marginalization. And then in terms of thinking about the environmental context here in the UK, environmental activists are using intersectionality to think about the issue of environmentalists, so that is to frame their issue and to communicate the issue of environmentalism through intersectionality, even though sometimes it might seem simpler to stick with one theme. There is this kind of the complexity of social inequality that's being that's being kind of communicated by activists. And then also thinking about the practical organizing level and the strategies that environmental activists are taking up. And then finally, just to come back to this notion of popular diffusion, that there is this tension between depoliticization and democratization of this idea of intersectionality, and therefore this kind of difficulty around the differences between a symbolic representation that's purely symbolic and deep structural change, and whether one is happening or the other when we think about the spaces that activists are pushing into. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Thank you so very much. We already have a number of questions for you. And Stavros asks, whether, he says, do you believe that green capitalism is actually effective? For example, does mass production of vegan products under capitalist working conditions helps climate change and societies to progress? So this is the first question for you, Lydia.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, and I think a really live debate within the world of green politics. I think it's really difficult to think about what green capitalism really means, because I think that, I mean, for me, green capitalism doesn't eradicate the kind of exploitation that allows capitalism to exist. And so I think if you're thinking from a Black feminist framework or an intersectional framework, at least within green capitalism, there continues to be the kind of social cleavages that intersectionality tries to push back against or to expose and then kind of deconstruct. And so I would be a bit hesitant to say that green capitalism is something that is effective. And I think you get at that in your question with this kind of mass production of vegan products and this continuing existence of this exploitative working conditions. And I'm not sure that green capitalism is even viable, given that mass production itself tends to speak to kind of emissions and carbon intensive industries. So yeah, I think that's an excellent question and really live debate. I'm not sure that's a very comprehensive answer, but I know that's a very live discussion that's going on at the moment.
Thank you very much, Lydia. And then there's another question from Ari. Ari is also one of my undergraduate students. He asks, in what other ways can we raise awareness about ecological and climate breakdown? And he asks, how could we be sure that our voices will be heard and that actions will be taken? And yet whether Green parties across Europe would help towards achieving this goal.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think in terms of raising awareness about ecological and climate breakdown, it's that's where this relationship with popular media and press is really important for kind of creating this conversation about these environmental issues. And I think that environmental activists, including Extinction Rebellion, are already doing really excellent work to kind of raise awareness of these issues by protesting, generating media interest, and just kind of generally creating these conversations around environmental issues. I think that in terms of making sure that voices are heard across Europe and through Green parties, that's a really interesting point. I think that's something that we will see over the coming years as Green parties do come to greater prominence. I know here in the UK, the Scottish Green Party has just announced a power sharing deal with the Scottish government, and it will be the first time that we see kind of Green Party representatives in the UK, and we're kind of yet to really see what how Green parties function in government, as they've often been this kind of external pressure voice. And so I think it will be super interesting to see the ways that they kind of approach politics, not as a single issue phenomenon, but as a kind of holistic, broad thing. And I think it will be really interesting, just because we haven't really seen a massive representation of Green parties in governments. And I think that's where intersectionality will be interesting, to see whether these Green parties do engage with intersectionality, well, as they do their politics.
Great, thank you, Lydia. We have 2 more questions and we have 5 minutes left. The one question is from James. I'm really sorry, but I'm not sure I actually understand the question. I don't know, Lydia, whether you're able to see the comment. I think that this has to, this has to do with James actually saying that your account is a bit out of date, and that maybe, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know how to summarize this. So I don't know whether, I'm so sorry, honestly.
Yeah, no worries. No, I can see the question. I think James is getting at that the account that I gave there, or some of the critiques that I explored of Extinction Rebellion, are from mainly from 2019. So I do take that they are not the most recent events that kind of are generating conversation about Extinction Rebellion. But I think that given the current context with coronavirus, I think there's been a bit of I'm kind of speaking about the last time in which people were organizing in the streets massively before the pandemic. And so those were some of the critiques which were really raised at the time, not just by the media or academics, but also by other activists, such as Wretched of the Earth, who I mentioned. I think James is also mentioning that the worst threat is the rise of ecofascism, and so ecofascism, this idea often which is tied to this idea of overpopulation, and which is really linked to the curtailing of women's rights and reproductive rights. I think that is an interesting point to make, because I think to say that that's a worse threat is true in many ways, but this kind of internal reflection also needs to take place within the environmental movement, because as scholars such as Andrew Newman have written about, there are ways that environmental activists can feed into policies that are not sensitive to some of the inequalities that can be reproduced through environmental policy. So I think that it's true that there are forms of environmentalism that are more exclusionary than those which I've explored in the presentation just now, but I think it's still important to have this kind of intersectional reflection within environmental activism, generally speaking.
Lovely, thank you, Lydia. And James, I'm sorry, I wasn't sure whether I would have summarized this the way it was supposed to be summarized.
I hope I addressed the question properly, James.
And since we have a couple more minutes, Despina is asking whether whether it's time to look back to indigenous wisdom, and especially for environmental issues, since they are anthropocentric issues. So I don't know if you could comment on that.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a really excellent question. I think it's really difficult because sometimes you do see the co-optation as well of indigenous thought and this kind of citation of indigenous thought without a genuine engagement with it. There's also this difficulty around indigenous thought being understood as a block, which it's not. There are lots of different types of thinking indigenously, lots of different indigenous communities that are contributing massively to this environmental debate. I think this point about anthropocentrism is really important and also really difficult because sometimes this discussion about decentering the human, I think, can ring really difficult for those who feel that they were never centered in the first place. So of course, anthropocentrism is a genuine issue that needs to be addressed within environmental activism, but I do think there are some risks of kind of sidestepping some of the issues that marginalized communities are facing that were never addressed to begin with. But I do think that it's really important to engage with different types of understandings of the environment and environmental issues. And also, I mean, there's lots to say about what the environment is anyway as a concept, and that's a whole other philosophical debate, but I think that opens up those discussions too, but it's a really excellent question, so thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you so very much. Last but not least, Eleanor Levinar, who is Associate Professor in Gender Studies at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lausanne. Her main areas of research are in the fields of feminist movements and theory, gender and law, intersectionality, and gender and political representation. Her last monograph, Feminist Trouble, Intersectional Politics in Post-Secular Times, published by Oxford University Press in 2020, investigates contemporary intersectional dynamics in feminist movements in France and Quebec, while her previous book, L'égalité introuvable, le féminisme, la parité et la république, published by Presse des Sciences Po 2007, analyzed the French party reform. She's also the author of an introduction to feminist theories, Les théories en étude de genre, excuse my French, with Marilène Libert. And she's also the co-editor of several volumes, for example, L'intersectionalité, enjeux théoriques et pratiques, published in 2016 with Farinaz Fassah and Marta Rocca. A comparative volume on gender quotas in Europe, titled Transforming Gender Citizenship, the irresistible rise of gender quotas in Europe, with Ruth Rubio Marin, published with Cambridge University Press in 2018, and Intersectionality in Feminist and Queer Movements, Challenging Privileges, with Liz Evans, published with Routledge in 2020. And Eleanor's presentation is titled Intersectional Praxis and Feminist Ethics, and we definitely look forward to that. Eleanor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naya. Thanks for organizing this, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be in such good company. So I'm trying to share my screen. Yes. And please, Naya, give me a heads up when I have 10 minutes left, because it's been a long day and I really don't know how fast or slow I'm going to be today. So as I said, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the people in the public for your patience, because it's a long symposium and I'm the last one. So I changed my title a little bit because I realized that it was a more accurate title, Intersectional Emotions and Feminist Ethics. And I'm going to try to explain what I'm trying to get at. Intersectionality in feminist movement has kind of become a common language, but also a site of struggle. So in some contexts, intersectionality has become a mainstream discursive or visual language for feminism. And here you have the cover of a manifesto from a German, from the Zurich chapter of the Swiss women's strike. I don't know if you know, but we've had a women's strike, a feminist strike for the last 2 years in Switzerland, starting in 2019, just before COVID. And it's every year now. And so this is the recent cover of the women's strike Zurich chapter, where you see that there is this kind of visual imagery of a variety of women, including women of color, veiled women, old women, queer women. And so, however, while this visual has become mainstream, there is also a resistance to the appropriation of intersectionality by in particular racialized feminists in some contexts, and I'm going to focus here on France and Switzerland, and a little bit on Quebec, also in Canada as well, where contexts where racialized women have struggled and still struggle to be heard by hegemonic white feminist organization, and where they appropriate intersectionality also as a site of struggle, and they contest the way it's been appropriated by white feminists. So the language of intersectionality has become a site of struggle, both like this kind of new norm, but also a site of contest within feminist movements. And so I want to address this kind of tension between what is presented by white feminists as a desire for intersectionality and its kind of non-emergence or impossible emergence in feminist practices in white women's organization. So of course, intersectionality is, we could say, like an old praxis for racialized feminists, and we have a lot of scholarly work documenting intersectional practices and theory from racialized women, Black feminist organization, Chicana feminist, etc., since the 70s and even before. But it has become also a kind of new grammar or a new norm for white feminists to adopt. So we have studies who kind of document a gap. So I mean, the way we talk about this gap between discourse and practice is also interesting, right? So we could say there is a kind of a lack of translation of discourses into intersectional practices. So like a discursive adoption, which is a little bit hypocritical because there's no concrete change. We could say that this is the result of a kind of resistance to intersectionality by white feminists, or we can also approach it as using what Sarah Ahmed used for anti-racism, said that this is an effect of a kind of non-performativity, that the work that intersectionality discourses does when it's adopted by white feminists is actually to not make the emergence of intersectionality possible in those white spaces. So there is an ambivalent discourse of desire and this kind of puzzled or impossibility, so-called, so presented as impossibility from white feminists. And I think that exploring the emotions that are tied to intersectionality may help us understanding this gap or resistance and non-performativity of intersectionality. So what I would like to do now is to kind of take seriously this desire, so-called desire for intersectionality, or that intersectionality stimulates, and all the emotions that are attached to the idea, the political idea of intersectionality, and to the failure to act upon it by white feminists. And here I want to, and here I go back to what Sarah Ahmed said in the Cultural Politics of Emotion, I mean, the second edition, like the conclusion of the book, when she's talking about emotion as political. And she says, receiving anger is both a political action and an emotional state, this calls into question the conditions under which it is possible for just hearings to translate into action. So it entails accepting that one's own position might anger others, and hence allows one position to be open to critique by others. So here she's pointing, the conclusion of the book is a reflection on feminist emotions, and she reflects on the role that those emotions play in feminist politics, and how anger, might stop feminist action from taking place, and how, well, in particular, white feminists should react to the anger that's addressed to them. So understanding emotions and the ethical drive of feminism, that those emotions are a symptom of, like we have emotion about feminism and about intersectionality because we are emotionally attached to feminism. So there is this ethical drive towards feminism is important in order to understand the non-performativity of intersectionality. So, oops, sorry. So this presentation and this kind of exploration of intersectional feelings draws on research I've done in France and Quebec, and that's in the book that Naya mentioned, Feminist Trouble, that was published last year. It also draws on a recent piece that I co-authored with Charlène Calderaro, and which is based on fieldwork in France and Switzerland. And so I'm going to look at intersectional emotion on the part of racialized feminists. And I'm going to talk about self-care, pain, and resentment. Then on the part of white feminists, I'm going to talk about anger, self-righteousness, self-education, and needs. And then I'm going to try to conclude about why this kind of exploration of emotion may encourage us, or at least me, to think what could be a kind of feminist ethics of care within feminist movement to as a response to what those emotions are telling us about the need to put into practice intersectionality. So I want first to expose a little bit the discourses of racialized feminists about intersectionality. So I did my field work when I studied intersectionality in France and Quebec. I was mainly interested in the racial divide and racial/religious, because I was in particular interested in the question of how public debates, political debates about Muslim veiling had divided the feminist movement and reconfigured some forms of activism. So I really I didn't look at other axes of oppression and division within feminist movement. And so, as we know from previous research, which I cited in the introduction, organizing one's own for racialized feminist is a way to practice self-care and collective support, and also to generate joy among racialized feminists in the face of pervading and systemic racism and Islamophobia in the two contexts that I studied. And so here are some quotes from activists. At the moment, there is so much Islamophobia, including in many feminist groups. As far as we are concerned, we would really like to welcome veiled Black women in our group, clearly to support them. So this is a kind of, declaration of support from an Afro-feminist activist in Paris. And so using her discourses on intersectionality as a show of support for women who are victims of Islamophobia. And more recently, another, the same actually, Afrofeminist is also explaining why she decided to self-organize with other Black women in Paris, Black feminists in Paris. And she says it's about giving each other power. This is what feminism is about, giving each other power. And when you don't have it anymore, another sister can give it to you. And that's good. So you can see here, and also in the last quote, this idea of collective power being created by self-organization and self-care. So those spaces as spaces to support each other in a structurally racist society, of course. So then intersectionality also brings feelings of pain on the part of racialized women, in particular when they talk about their work in trying to make white feminists aware of their issues and to create solidarity with them, a demand which is often met with indifference or answers of delay, like, yes, we will take care of this issue, but, not now, we're not ready, or intersectionality is too complicated, or, we need to be more trained, or answers like that. So here, a Muslim feminist activist in Montreal is explaining that she feels really tired. And so she feels this pain of like having worked very hard to convince mainstream white feminist organization to include issues that are important for Muslim women on their agenda, and that she has made a lot of efforts for not a lot of gain, and that she's been met with these discourses of like, women in our centers, so like grassroots feminist centers, are not ready for this. So they're not ready for intersectionality. So 1 year, the coalition said, yes, we will vote on this, or we adopt intersectionality, but the year after, there's no progress. And there is this argument that it's too complicated, or that, grassroots feminist activists are not ready to adopt intersectional practices. So asking racialized women to wait to take into consideration their demands. And so finally, there's a form also in line with this pain.
And 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. In line with this pain and difficulty to see intersectionality translate into practice in a white feminist organization, there is an idea of resentment toward white feminists, because they behave, as Soraya says in this quote, as if they are the guardians or the pillars of the feminist movement, and that they don't want to make space for the other. And so here, I want to say that a lot of the literature on resentment see it as like a kind of victimhood identity, like adopting the identity of a victim, of an injured identity. And that's not at all what I saw or what I understood from racialized feminist discourses on resentment. I see resentment as a claim for the right moral bonds to be restored with white feminists, to have white feminists keep their promise to be feminist and to be in solidarity with other women. And it's the same for hurt and pain. And here I draw on the work on Noémie Michel, when she says that reaction to racial injurious discourses are not, when pain is expressed or resentment is expressed, it's not about a claim for identity, it's an equality claim, first and foremost. And so this is also what I find in the discourses of racialized feminists talking about intersectionality. So intersectional praxis for the intersectional group of racialized feminists is grounded in forms of solidarity, power, and joy. But the work of bearing and caring for intersectionality in place of white feminists and in the places occupied by white feminists in those white spaces exposes racialized feminists to racial injuries and to the failure of the moral bonds that they expect should be at the heart of the feminist project, that is to be treated and to be cared for equally. So there is this kind, I read resentment as a kind of a call for new emotional bonds. And I'll quote an activist in Montreal saying, which is, I mean, not even resentment, it's a call for love, actually. You have to accept that we are here and you have to love us. Otherwise, it's not going to work. You cannot just tolerate us. So we can see how there is an emotional grammar underlying this call. There is an emotional, the way that the feminist politics of intersectionality translates into emotional demands that are specific. So now I want to turn to white feminists, maybe more quickly. So not surprisingly, of course, white feminists resist intersectionality, as Liz already mentioned. For the case of the UK, there is a lot of anger sometimes, or often actually, from white feminists, maybe especially from older generation, when they talk or where they are confronted with intersectional demands, or demands to become intersectional, or to take into account this intersectionality. So in the case of France, for example, in particular, this is also rooted in a denial of race that Jean already exposed and explored in her presentation. So denial brings anger on the part of many white feminists, especially in the French context, especially older feminists. So talking about like racialized feminists who are self-organizing in Paris in the middle of the 2010s, she says, well, they don't bother me, which is like, of course, very demeaning. They can continue with their ravings. I'm not going to forbid them. So here she places herself in a kind of self-righteous position, also, and a position of authority in the movement, as if she had the power to forbid them. Their message, it's nationalism, racialist vision of the world, like other women who decide to organize on some basis, be it religious or geographical. So then she kind of nuances a little bit, and she says it's not a problem, but it's not a message. So there is a disqualification, of course, of the political ambition and scope of self-organization by racialized feminists, and it's not new. So I don't really need to comment, I think, on this. However, what we see also emerging, and so what we explore in the paper I mentioned, is this kind of white self-education and self-critique. So this kind of idea that intersectionality brings what we coined a new feeling rule using sociologist Harley Horschild's conceptual vocabulary. So intersectionality, like the acknowledgement of its importance, the desire to self-educate oneself about intersectionality, what it does is, to some extent, it kind of prevents, or prevents a little bit the typical expression of white fragility, of white resistance with tears, etc., to a discussion on race in some feminist organization. So here you have a young Swiss feminist activist from the women's strike I mentioned, who said, I had to think a lot when we were writing the charter of the strike. I was put in charge of looking for numbers on the topic about which I did not understand anything. I was wondering, why do we have to talk about racism, about LGBT, and so on? In a feminist manifesto. So you see that, okay, she's starting from very far away. So I had to read a lot of reports and stuff, and it started to make sense. And that was a great moment. It was very cool. I learned a lot, and it confronts you to your own blind spot. So here you see this kind of, desire to self-educate through having to take into consideration intersectionality in your activism. And then this can also be at a more collective level, because Sophie, the previous one, was talking about her own individual experience. So at the collective level, so here you have an officer in a big umbrella organization, of feminist organization in Montreal, who explains how the whole organization has to change its practices. And so she goes back to actually the dynamic that the quote from Soraya was saying about, like, asking racialized women to wait for their demands to be taken into consideration. So here she said that some of those women have left frustrated because some discourses were felt as violent. So she could have said were violent, but like this feeling that you constantly ask us to wait because you, white women, need to be trained. So of course we have to work to question the way we bring discussion about topics that we know will be disputed. So here you see that it's a collective way of the organization, white feminists, there is work to be done and they are responsible for it. So it's not about personally self-educating. So how to do it so that this discussion will not in fact be detrimental to the people who are concerned in the first place and have the courage to come to those spaces. So it calls into question our practices. So here we see a little bit of maybe a glimpse of possibility of changes in practices in organization. So what I try to document so far is this kind of desire that doesn't take really the responsibility for the lack of intersectional praxis. So there is this kind of dutifulness, vigilance on the part of white women, but it does not really materialize in changes in practice. And so how many minutes do I have, Naya? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I would say 1.
Okay, so you didn't give me the 5. Okay, yes. So it does not materialize. So there is still this kind of non-performativity. So I want to conclude. It's a kind of fake conclusion because it's a long conclusion, but I will be very fast. So I want to conclude in terms of how it got me thinking into can we use the ethic of care to try to rethink this relation. So emotions, starting from the point that emotions signal the kind of moral dimension of feminist bonds and of feminist intersectional practices, as well as the persistence of asymmetries and hegemonic relation and the centrality of whiteness in the non-materialization of intersectionality. Can an ethic of care bring about new emotions and new feminist politics in the sense of helping to debunk hierarchies between feminists? And you will have to read my book to know the answer. No, I'm kidding. So I think care ethics are maybe an interesting starting point to think about this, about like changing those relations and those the emotions attached to it, because it's a relational ethics. So it asks the question of how to be in relation with proximate and distant others. And it's an ethic that's take into account asymmetries of power, which demands different types of responsibilities depending on where you are situated in the power relation. So responsibility is reciprocal in care relation, but it's not symmetrical. And privilege translates into more responsibility. The more privilege, the more responsibility, the more moral responsibility you have vis-a-vis the less privileged, especially in a political community such as a feminist movement. So what I try to propose is to understand feminism as a moral and political promise to care for feminist subject as equal. And I try to develop in the book what is caring in this context of feminism as a political and ethical activity of creating a space of possibility for the other. And I try to delineate or define what type of, in practice, in feminist praxis, what would it mean? So not to stay at the abstract level, but as a pragmatic ethics, what would it ask for feminists and how it would redefine the way we envision feminist practice. And here you have a couple of examples. And so I'll stop here. Because I'm out of time, and I thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very, very much, Eleanor. Thank you so very much. Do we have any questions, Stavro, on Facebook? Okay. All right. Am I allowed a question, please? Okay. I'm struggling. And this has nothing to do with the way you elaborate your argument. Maybe this has to do with how my failure to grasp the argument, but I have a little trouble understanding how resentment, which I think only has a negative connotation, right, as a word in English, is actually being employed by you as something so positive, I do not understand the exact mechanics of it, although I find it fascinating as an argument, and the way you link it in the end with ethics of care. Could you please elaborate on that? Thank you.
So I drew actually on the work on, among other, Jean Beaman, who was a Belgian philosopher who survived the Holocaust. And he talked about resentment as the kind of moral, as a moral demand that the pain, the violence that has been inflicted is not forgotten. So he really looked at resentment as a kind of moral requirement that, you know, for example, Holocaust survivors asked from the states, from, various institutions. So it's like, it's not the incapacity to forgive. It's not, the incapacity to forget. It is a trace. It is like this kind of materialization of a moral demand, a moral requirement that is imposed on the other because we're part of the same political community, So in that sense, I think that resentment expresses a moral demand, You made a promise and I will be resentful until you keep your word on this promise and you act on this promise. So I think it is this kind of for me, at least, it translates not only the politics of intersectionality and racism within feminist movement, but also the kind of moral demands that's underlying those politics. I don't know if I make clear.
Yes, it did make it more clear in my head. Thank you, Eleanor. Thanks. So I don't think we have any questions, but we do have a comment from Pete that says that he finds very, very interesting your view, especially in relation to what you said about moral responsibility and privilege. So thank you, Eleanor. Thank you all. And I think that now it's time for me to ask you to take turns responding to a couple of questions that I have. And these would, this would work as a roundtable discussion, I guess. So if you don't mind, my first question is the following. Okay. Those of us involved in studying social movements and activism, or being actually involved in activism and in social movements as activists, we know from experience that a movement's inclusivity is circumscribed at least once in the movement's lifetime. And this has to do with many times limited resources or strategic reasons, or having to function in a hostile environment. So, and I'm asking the question thinking about Cyprus, because this is where it's Cyprus that I'm studying. So my question is, could any movement ever be described as intersectional? Is it something that could characterize a movement throughout its duration? Is it even possible for that to happen? Thanks. Who wants to go first? I mean, I know it's a very broad question, but I guess I was thinking about it more on a theoretical level. Could a movement really be intersectional once and for all? Or and I was thinking specifically about the LGBTIQ movement in Cyprus and all the struggles and all the internal sort of like clashes and the thinking and the energy that goes into the movement trying to be intersectional, but there is always someone who's left outside, who's left behind, who's being hurt, who ends up with this feeling of resentment because they, you know, a word was not kept, a promise was not kept. Thanks. Anyone?
I think I'll maybe say a little bit. I think it's a really good question and a really difficult one. And I'd be interested to hear what the other speakers at this symposium think, because I wonder if intersectionality is a call for this kind of continuous becoming, like this idea of striving for something, but not necessarily knowing that we're going to reach it, or not necessarily seeing it maybe even in our lifetimes, but this kind of this idea of just always asking yourself the question about the work that you're doing, who you're including, who you might be leaving behind and out, and this kind of willingness to have this internal reflection, and therefore also this willingness to include more people in the conversation, because you're aware that your own positionality necessarily limits what you can see and how you do your work. So I wonder if it's like a call to becoming rather than an aim for a kind of concrete finished product, which seems a little bit contradictory, because social movements fight for a goal, a kind of end. It's kind of teleological, but yeah, I wonder if it's about this becoming, and I'd be keen to hear what the people think about that.
Thank you, Lydia.
I can jump in next. First, I just want to say I really want to thank my co-panelists for their really excellent presentations. I really learned a lot and really appreciate being in the space with you all. So I think, you know, I really want to echo kind of what Lydia just said around the sort of intersectionality as a state of becoming, rather than thinking about it as a sort of finished end product. And I think, you know, part of that state of becoming is the movement work itself. So for example, I'm just thinking here in the United States of the Black Lives Matter movement, or the movement for Black Lives, and the ways in which the boundaries around who that movement is supposed to target, i.e. not just cisgender Black individuals, but also thinking about, for example, the sort of experiences or the incidents of police brutality against Black women. I think that in of itself is the work of the movement. And so I think in that sense, we're only, you know, by thinking about it as a state of becoming, we're only getting closer and closer to doing that work, to actually doing the movement work that the movement it pretends to address. And then also, I think it's helpful to think about just a general, like in a broader sense, around the distinction between sort of insiders and outsiders of any movement, and what it actually means to be part of a social movement. So again, I'm just thinking sort of more anecdotally around Black Lives Matter and who is supposed to be seen or interpreted as sort of under that umbrella versus people who are meant to be seen as more sort of allies of that movement. So that might be another way of thinking about these questions.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll have a go.
Thank
yeah, I mean, I share Jean and Lydia's kind of views on it, and I suppose it puts me in mind of the research that Zakia Luna did on the Women's March, when she was giving out surveys and questioning people who've been involved in these women's marches. And I think she said she was sort of speaking to one white woman who was like, "This is such an inclusive and intersectional space." And she, like 5 minutes later, went and spoke to an African-American woman who was there, who was like, "This is really off and I feel very uncomfortable." So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, you know, it feels slightly uncomfortable judging things to be intersectional or not to be intersectional. I mean, everyone's going to have 100 different views on that, depending on their own positionality, where they fit into the power dynamics of any individual space. And within a social movement, there's like millions and millions of different spaces, even within the same group. Like each meeting has a totally different dynamic. You go and observe them. Sometimes it seems very free flowing and people are kind of engaging along similar lines, and other times there's clear kind of points of resistance to engaging with certain topics. So I suppose it depends on kind of whose perspective, right? and the idea that, intersectionality is something you kind of work towards, like a kind of normative social good, right? That it's an inherently good thing to be doing, to be working on, making your kind of praxis more intersectional. I'll pass over to someone else now.
Thank you, Liz.
I'm happy to chime in briefly, even though I think for the next question, I was more comfortable with it just because of the difficulty of this big one. And my colleagues have been so fantastic in how they've answered it. And I think with the LGBTI movement, we see in a way the heightening intersectional consciousness. And actually Cyprus is really a key moment for me in that, because I remember being in Nicosia at the ILGA Europe annual meeting, I think it was in 2016, where intersectionality really featured strongly in, the whole organizing panels, and all of the materials were really trying to drive home this idea of the importance of how we have to think about the movement's positioning towards working with an intersectional praxis. And that was, so inspiring. At the same time, a lot of people pointed out how even sometimes efforts to make things more intersectional, for example, having co-chairs from representing different genders to make sure that we had representation of both gay and lesbian members in the past, was then also really transitory when we think of gender in such a binary way, so that something that was seen as, getting us part of the way there has to be rethought and moved now. And the same came to, Liz's presentation around ability. We had a lot of questions on class and ability, and how even these conversations we're having were reaching members of the community while we were having them. And so these are, I think, the constant, the questions we have. Also, how do we make spaces and push when a lot of the most marginalized members of our communities are working in a volunteer-based movement, largely volunteer-based movement, where you need to have also time and resources and biographical availability to partake and shape the discourses in these ways. So it just, it shows that this is really hard work. And I think the LGBTI movement is a great example, even just within those categories in these acronyms of, various exclusions that just continue to persist and that we have to keep addressing. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks. All right. So, okay. I have another question. And of course, members of the audience, please remember that you can type in your comments and your questions. Oh, yes. Okay. All right. We have some comments here. I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump in and ask my own question, but we have some very interesting comments here. Pete says that he agrees with Lydia, and that intersectionality is a path and way to question our work and practices. Okay, and then Pete. All right, lovely. Well, I don't see any questions. I see some very beautiful comments about your responses. So let me just ask you something else. And this is a sincere question, because this is something I'm currently working on, something I'm trying to study. And I don't know whether I'm doing it the right way. Thinking about difficult times. We can take this pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, as an example, but thinking about difficult times more broadly, and thinking about the arguments all of you develop in relation to the specific movements or activism that you're studying in various countries, right? Can we say that difficult times are actually a factor that increases movements' intersectionality, in the sense that in difficult times, in times that are not easy, activists reach out to other activists. They see share interests, they see share trauma, they see shared pain, and they try to mobilize together. And I'm thinking about Lydia's presentation, and of course about Jean's presentation, about Philip's presentation. Everybody's presentation had this strong element of how activists come together when things get tough. And I don't know whether we can give a concrete answer to that. What do you think?
I think I can just dive in with some thoughts. You know, this is a really interesting question. It connects back also, you know, and Liz made this point about difficult times being, for many of these communities, we study it kind of around all the time. And when I think about COVID and the LGBTI communities, I mean, there, you know, these communities dealt with a health crisis and a pandemic that unfortunately a lot of our fields just ignored or didn't study because it was seen as niche or it was, you know, not political, even though political institutions were exacerbating a health crisis that was killing so many people. And so it was something lived and felt by activists. I don't know if you know, coming into the COVID pandemic, that it would be something so new, this kind of a crisis for many of these communities. And so I think that, you know, when I did a project on intersectionality coming out of the financial crisis, and a lot of the activists that I were talking to were saying, well, you know, it's really challenging and there's less funding, et cetera, but it's not like it was great before. You know, that was kind of the general theme. So I think a lot of the communities we study have a lot of familiarity working in difficult times, and there may have never been a not difficult time. But I think, you know, your question also gets a little bit at the sense of sometimes these moments of shared threat can heighten our interconnectedness in ways. And I hope that there's some opportunities to be found in crisis and moments. And I think that can come about with some of the conversations that are provoked in challenging times. That said, my concern, at least looking at the LGBTI movement, is that difficult times can also sometimes weaponize certain rights against others. And we see, you know, for example, when you see something like a Trump Pride rally where certain members of LGBTI communities, mainly upper middle class white gay men, are then used in rhetoric to say that we face a threat of migration or something like that. And I'm a little afraid that, you know, as the more privileged in these groups become incorporated into things like Nation, can they actually buy into some of these narratives? And that would be my concern, that when there's these difficult times for broader straight cis white people, that then it can affect certain communities within the marginalized groups that I study. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. Yes, and this, oh yeah. And Pete is actually commenting on that. It says difficult times do lead to getting closer and more united. It's someone might say in our nature, society, community, uniting to overcome difficulties, and think of the HIV/AIDS pandemic crisis, activists, women in particular, jumping in to support and increase the claims for actions to protect the victims and their families. For many communities, every day is a difficult time, yet moments of crisis spread that feeling across and lead to more cooperation rather than in an everyday situation. Yes, so I guess the other question could be, what do we define as difficult times, right? So yes, thank you, Philip. Anyone else that would like to have a go?
No, I just wanted to follow up on what Philip said. I think so, and of course I agree also with Pete's comment. I think the difficult time in terms of like feminist activism have also been brought by the rise of populism, right? So this kind of weaponization of women's rights against migrants, refugees, Muslims in Europe, and this is like a very it's a tricky situation, right? That feminist actors have not been used to deal with in the past, because it was easy, you know, the state was a kind of ally or an enemy, but then, you know, you were working on both sides in terms of like demonstrating against the state, but also using the state to get funding and to get a lot of legislation passed, etc. But right now it's very different, because the state is promoting feminationalism. So, you know, so it's promoting women's rights if it helps bringing a kind of bringing a xenophobic, anti-migrant, anti-Muslim agenda. So how do you, as feminist organization, how do you confront this? How do you oppose this? And I think this is a tricky political moment because of that configuration, which is in some, I think maybe, yeah, which is new in some ways. So I see difficulty here. Like now in France, there is like small groups of women who are affiliated with the far right and who call themselves feminists. So and and journalists are very happy to go and interview them and like blow the thing totally out of proportion and etc. etc. And so what do you do when you have this kind of, it's not even a cooptation, right? It's a total instrumentalization of that discourse. So I think this makes it a difficult moment, but also then forces feminist actors, feminist organization to adopt intersectionality or perish, because that's the only weapon against feminationalism that feminists have, I think. So
thank you so very much. Okay.
Yeah, I'll have, oh, sorry, go on. I was just gonna
no, please go ahead. I mean,
yeah,
we still have some time.
Yeah, in terms of disability rights activism, I think there's a slight feeling amongst disability activists in particular that the failure perhaps of other social movements in the wake of the 2008 economic crash to do much around disability, when disabled people were being presented as scroungers and basically the cause of the economic crash in certain sections of the media in the UK. There's a sort of slight kind of feeling that they can't really rely on activists and other groups. And that's not to say that there aren't other activist groups that were doing good things, right? I mean, there was some kind of Occupy discussions around disability. There have been moments at which other social movement activists have sought to engage with disability, but a feeling perhaps that there is just such a kind of pervasive nature of ableism, even amongst, so-called radical social justice activists on the left, that they just don't want to go anywhere near disability at all. And thinking about the impact of COVID and the number of op-ed pieces I've read by journalists who are dealing with long COVID now, who talk about how they now understand what it is to be disabled, coping with long-term health conditions, these kind of moments of performative solidarity that I'm not optimistic will lead to a kind of broader engagement with the politics of the disability rights movement. So I think there's both an opportunity, but I think there's also a kind of frustration, frankly, at those who kind of talk about radical social justice, but are just totally unwilling to kind of even talk about disability. Sorry, that's a bit gloomy, but
thank you, Liz. I mean, Athanasia completely, totally agrees with you. So, well, same here. Does any of our speakers want to add something to that, or? Okay. All right. Okay. So just let me read some comments we got here. Herman says that pink washing is something to be avoided when it comes to LGBTI plus, when it comes to the LGBTI plus movement. And personally, I couldn't agree more. Then there is a question from Matthew to me. He's asking, what are the specific problems causing divisions in the Cyprus LGBTIQ movement? Matthew, very, very quickly, because I mean, today it's the day that our presenters and speakers are supposed to present their work and respond to questions. We could definitely like chat at some other point, but the findings of my work, and others might disagree with me, is that this has to do with the existence of nationalism on the island because of the ethnic division. It has to do with the fact that the country is still a very traditional, it's a very traditional society. Changes came top down because of the European Union and Europeanization. It wasn't, I mean, the movement did not, it wasn't so much grassroots. So this causes problem even amongst the community, you know, I mean, trans individuals being alienated from the movement, or debates in previous decades of whether, you know, the Greek Cypriot LGBTIQ organization, the main one, should be collaborating with the Turkish Cypriot LGBTIQ organizations. I mean, this is changing, but I guess it has to do with the fact that this is a divided island where traditional perceptions about gender and sexuality persist because of the power that the Orthodox Church of Cyprus has. So yeah, but we can chat about that anytime you want. So do we have any more questions? Do we have anything on Facebook or? Okay, lovely. Any of our great, amazing speakers, is there something you would like to add, or before we call it a day? No, okay. Well,
I would just say,
yes,
I think we would like to thank you for bringing us together and organizing such a really important event. It's rare, at least in political science, to have a panel like this with such interesting work being presented. So for me, it was a great pleasure to be here. So thank you, Naya, so much for doing this, this hard work.
Well,
yeah, likewise. Thank you so much. It was really great.
I'm the one who should be thanking you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. As you have realized from seeing how many people attended the event, this is something that it was much needed and much wanted, and I hope we'll be able to continue having conversations like this amongst ourselves and with our students and with members of the public. So once again, thank you all so very much for your invaluable time, for presenting your amazing international work. Thank you, and have a good day or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks so much.